Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have a blast about the Nativity story, the Christmas story. Did it really happen? Well, you know where we stand on that, but you got to build a case, right? You got to present the evidence and show why. First things first, though, up front, the guest I have on, go get their books, okay? Jonathan MS Pearce, Aaron Adair, and that's Dr. Aaron Adair. He has a PhD in physics. He wrote The Star of Bethlehem. Make sure you go check it out. A Skeptical View. Also, the Nativity, a critical examination, which we're going to go through even further, but today is the first day joining in and actually doing that. So be sure to go check out the books, and I want to go ahead and promote them, letting you guys know what websites to check out. Down in the description, it's draaronadair.com. You can go to his website, check out what he's got going on here. He has the book, of course, as well, but we'll get to that. Jonathan MS Pearce, go check out his blog. He is always writing and stay up to date.
Can I just add to that? Can I add to that? We have, so the Patheos non-religious, there's about 30 writers there. We have effectively, I don't know how much of this I'm allowed to say, but we've effectively been cancelled. And so a lot of us are moving over to a brand new platform called Only Sky. Watch your space, because the launch at the beginning of January is going to be big, and it's a whole place for the non-religious community to coalesce. Really
well, let me know. I'll change those links in the previous shows so that we can get it up to speed. Awesome. Be sure to go and subscribe, check him out. And his YouTube channel, A Tippling Philosopher. He has tons of videos. And if you don't like what he says, you can at least look at those chops on his cheeks, okay? I don't know anyone else who has them like that. So that's one reason to go over there. He also has the books on Amazon. You can get plenty of books and stay up to speed. If you want to strengthen your epistemology and understand why an atheistic worldview might make a lot more sense, go check out his latest book, Why I Am Atheist and Not a Theist. Interesting way of titling it. Trying to confuse me here on purpose. And also Aaron Adair's book, like I said, The Star of Bethlehem, a Skeptical View. He has a PhD in physics, so he might know a thing or two when it comes to stars, and we'll probably be discussing some of that today. Final thing I'm going to plug before we get into the show is my MythVision Patreon. I just dropped more. I mean, look, Ben Stanhope daggered William Lane Craig here on the whole cosmology and Genesis and the Bible. It's just, there's all sorts of great stuff. Tomorrow, I think, is Joseph Smith's birthday, or it's the day after. I'll probably be launching this. I don't know, but help support us out, on the Patreon. You guys can ask questions too when I go to interview scholars. With that being said, let's get our intro started.
Go and pray someone else's brat. Go on.
We were led by a star.
Led by a bottle of all right. Go on out.
Well, we must see him. We have brought presents.
Out.
Gold, frankincense, myrrh.
Well, why didn't you say he's over there?
Your tiny Jesus, your golden fleece diapers with your tiny little fat balled up fist
He
pawing.
was a man. He had a beard.
Look, I like the baby version the best. Do you hear me?
Dear 8-pound, 6-ounce, newborn infant Jesus. Don't even know a word yet. Just little infant, so cuddly, but still omnipotent.
We just thank you for all the races I've won and
We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Who else doesn't like 8-pound, 6-ounce baby Jesus? Hallelujah. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. And this is your first time here, Dr. Aaron Adair. Welcome. And Jonathan MS Pearce. What's up, guys?
Great to
Pleasure
be here.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, we followed the star and here we are, right? Did the Christmas story even happen, right? That's the big question. This might work out for mythicists who watch the channel all the time. They love it. They're like, yeah, of course. But then there's those who think there may have been a guy, and we're going to be dealing with what is going on in the Bible. But before we do, I want everyone to know who's tuning in that you can super chat your questions, and throughout our discussion, we will do our best to answer those questions. I will try not to leave anyone out. So how do we begin this topic here, Jonathan?
I think I get really excited when I the prospect of talking about the Nativity, and the reason I get really excited is because this is, I think, the one area of the Bible, the whole Bible, that is most obviously contradictory and most obviously problematic, because you've got two what should be identical stories, or one story being told in two ways that should at least be coherent, that are entirely not. Right, so this is the most obvious problematic part of certainly the New Testament, but you could argue the Bible as a whole. And whatever you say about whether Jesus existed or not, from the point of view of being a mythicist or a historicist, right? He was never born in this way. Absolutely, I think you can say this really, really confidently. So I think the best way to start this conversation off tonight is possibly, what are the ramifications if his birth narratives are incorrect? So if either Luke or Matthew, or more probably both, are incorrect in their claims of Jesus's birth, what then? What are the ramifications of this? And I wonder, what you two have to say about that.
Well, I'll add to that as well, is that this is also probably the main story in the New Testament, or at least the gospel stories, where there are numerous international forces involved. So you would think it would make quite a dent in the historical record, from the census ordered by Caesar Augustus for the entire Roman Empire, the coming of the wise men from the east, from Persia, Babylon, of course, involving King Herod. So we're talking multiple world powers all involved in a short period of time. And if this ain't historical, if they're willing to make this up, what are they not willing to make up?
Well put.
That's such a good point. So the basis of writing this book originally was the fact that this is the most, exactly what Aaron said there, which is this is the part of the New Testament and the part of Jesus's life that intersects most with known history, right? So this is where you can validate and verify the claims in the Gospels, right? Potentially is where you should be able to verify the claims in the Gospels, and it's the most obvious intersection of known history. Then when you go to the other end of his life, you've got the resurrection, which is also a period where Jesus' life intersects with known history. So you've got Pontius Pilate, you've got death and burial, sort of an execution customs in Jewish law, so on and so forth. So you can verify some of the claims being made. So you've got these kind of two bookends. I'll probably get this the wrong way around, depends which way you're looking at me. But you've got like the birth, that's probably the end. I should probably have that over here. So
depends if you're Hebrew. On our side, you might read from right to left. I mean, come on.
Exactly. Man. So you've got the birth, and then you've got the death of Jesus, right? So if these intersect with known history and they fail, so when we attempt to verify them and they fail, right? What does it say about everything in between? So you've got his entire life and the ministry that doesn't intersect with known history. And so we're using inductive reasoning, you're saying like, okay, we found out that when we try and verify the claims of Jesus, they fail, so that they're almost certainly not true, certainly as reported in the Gospels. Then all this other stuff in the middle of these two bookends that we can't verify, how can we say they're true? What epistemic warrant do we have in believing all of this stuff? The wedding at Cana, like who was there, where, when, like how do we know it's true?
Yeah, this is a good point you bring up in your book. So just once again, quick plug of the Nativity. A critical examination. You did a good job grabbing Christian quotes. Like you let them speak, because if it's just critics, they're going to go, yeah, you went and pulled just another critic. But these were Christians who were going, literalists, stop. You're doing more damage than you're doing help, because you guys are trying to keep this literally historically true. However, as much as you wanted to bite on that, you were like, I can't, because they're not even being consistent. Like it's the pot calling the kettle black. They don't realize that their being not literal really unravels this whole thing. What do you trust?
This is a problem with so biblical literalists at least are consistent, right? And I've said this many times before, and I actually have I think they're more logically consistent. When you presuppose like the literal truth of the Bible, it's like okay, that's a real melts my brain, but at least you're being consistent across everything you say, and everything has to be true. And you understand if it's not true, then it's a house of cards that falls down. That's that thread that unravels your jumper, right? Whereas a liberal goes, okay, I can say the nativity is not true, but this bit is, and they have to jump through hoops to try and justify each part. And they're putting on a plaster here, they're putting a fire out there, they're putting a bandage on here, and it's just a big mess. And so you have, like, I would prefer to be a liberal, but then it's really inconsistent. But the literalists are more consistent, but it's just crazy to be a presuppositionalist, and it's epistemically like problematic. And so it's all a big mess. And as skeptics, it's like, well, it's all a load of rubbish. Job done.
I say we're even better than that, because it's not simply us just going rubbish,
no,
but we're able to dig in and say, and here's how they actually created the story. And we have much more than just a negative, but a wonderful, and I'd say beautiful, positive case that not only works here, but throughout the rest of the gospel stories as well. So once we understand how this story gets weaved together, we can follow those threads from birth to death, as we mentioned before. And when I say the threads, I mean literally things that might show up at the beginning of the story. You find them thematically being repeated at the end. And only once you get that does the story actually start to make any sense.
Wow.
So,
okay. Yeah, get us started.
I wonder if the first thing we should do, and most people will know this, but maybe Aaron, do you want to get the ball rolling at all with like talking about how what the kind of provenance of the Gospels are? So we've only got Luke and Matthew. So I suppose the first thing to say is the weird thing is this amazing story of Jesus' birth, or these two stories, because we're going to argue they are two separate stories, but assuming from the Christian point of view, it's one story. This amazing, miraculous story of Jesus' birth doesn't appear in Paul, doesn't appear in the first Gospel, Mark, earliest and most reliable, and it doesn't appear in John, who can look back at all the Gospels and decide what he's going to include, but decides not to include the nativity story. So that's the first problem. And then the provenance of the Gospels of Luke and Matthew themselves, who wrote them, when they were written, who for, so on and so forth. I don't know, Aaron, do you have something to say on that at all?
Yeah, and traditionally, we believe that Matthew is written before Luke, whether we want to go with the Q hypothesis that they had a common source, or the FAR hypothesis Luke uses Matthew. That's always a difficult discussion, and it's probably worth, 10 episodes in its own just to go through parsing the possible data. Either way, most often people will say that Matthew is first, and unlike Luke, he's not even trying to claim, and I did all this careful historical research, this is why you should believe me. He just basically starts out with a really strange, actually, first sentence where he says, the book of Genesis of Jesus. And that title, even alone, has been confusing to people. It is definitely not how you start a history book, where you don't give your name, you use a title that people are confused by, and then you try to put your audience to sleep with the genealogy.
Yeah. And
then the problem is Matthew can't even agree with Luke. So there's a lot here, as you were saying, building up. Paul doesn't mention it, but we're going to be talking about a bunch of stuff. The whole Alma, getting into the term. I mean, you name it. So where do you guys want to begin with this?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say very quickly, and Christians will say these are mere assertions. They aren't. Like, we don't know who wrote the Gospels. So when I say the Gospels, let's just think of Matthew and Luke only for the sake of argument. We don't know who wrote the Gospels. We don't know when they were written. We don't know where they were written. We have educated guesses at some of these, but we know that they were written after these people came to believe that the person they were writing about was the Messiah. In other words, they didn't write an account of Jesus' life and then go, oh, that's amazing, this guy must be the Messiah. They came to the writing table thinking, this is the Messiah, and my objective is to convince the people I'm writing for to my position that this is the Messiah. This is what's called ex post facto. They're after the fact sort of writing these accounts of Jesus' life, which means, are they going to be objective histories, or are they going to be effectively propaganda? Are Luke and Matthew historians? I was debated Lydia McGrew sometime last year on Unbelievable, and she calls Luke, she just slips it into conversation. Luke is a historian. It's like, no, he's not a historian. Like, he's not in any recognizable way is he a historian, and he uses no historiographical techniques of note. Certainly not as even contemporaneous historians were doing. And so therefore, my point of starting out is that these are problematic sources before we even look at what they say. Would you agree?
I would agree that they're at the very least questionable, right? We as Christians did not start with the things you're saying right now. So let's just be honest. We believed and we're approaching these texts to make sure that they are safe and that they continue to teach us the truth of what we believe to be literally true. Jesus was born of a virgin, et cetera, et cetera. Wise men, the whole nine is actually accurate and finding ways to make that true. You don't see apologists point blank. You might see a Christian who's more mature, realizes contradictions, recognizes the problems, and is saying, look, we went through the Enlightenment. I went through the Enlightenment. But like Dale Allison Jr. said the other day, many Christians have not gone through the Enlightenment, especially American ones. So, speaking from the South, it is still something that people are like trying to latch onto. They're not approaching it like that.
So I suppose the first place really to start off here is probably conception, right? That seems a pretty sensible place.
The genesis of Jesus, you mean? Oh, okay.
Yeah. And in this case, virgins, because there's nothing like a good virgin conversation. Where do we start in this? Because even talking about the virgin, there's so much to talk about. First thing I suppose to note is that Justin Martyr, writing all the way back when, as an early church kind of father and thinker, mentioned that many Christians didn't believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, which I think is really interesting because it shows that, contemporaneously, there were Christians who didn't believe in the virgin birth. And I think that's hugely interesting. I
agree. Early Christians, they were all over the place. They can't even agree that he was born of a virgin.
Yes. So I think, that's interesting. Then we have the idea of the virgin birth. Did it appear in the other Gospels? Does it appear in Paul? And it seems that there's just this absence of this idea anywhere else in any huge, overt way. I mean, John implies that there's a normal birth, and he's again being able to look back at all the Gospels to make his points. He would have known about the virgin birth claims, but doesn't mention anything about it. John 1:45 says the son of Joseph, and then 6:42 is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know. And then the Gospel of Thomas, a non-canonical gospel, gives no indication either that there's a virgin birth. It's not in Q, if you believe that Q is a sayings source. I personally don't, but if you come up with a thesis, if you adhere to the thesis of Q, it's not in there. So, I think the virgin claim is quite problematic. Do you have anything to say on it, Aaron?
Well, of all the people who probably should know about the virgin birth would be Mary. And if the Gospel of Mark is telling us anything historical, clearly Mary didn't know she was a virgin when she conceived, because the story there is that she doesn't have any memory of angels coming and telling her that she was going to be giving birth to the Son of God and the power of the Holy Spirit was going to overwhelm her and fill her with magic, who knows what's it, to pop out a baby without sex. And then somehow along the line, she thinks her son is going crazy during his ministry. It's like, did you forget the previous 30 years from the get-go, from before conception, you were being told these things? It doesn't just slip your mind. So if Mary doesn't know she was giving a virgin birth, then I think we have pretty good grounds to doubt.
So interesting note, though, what he just said is the 30 years. That's in Mark. He mentioning that she thought he was crazy. They said that their own family thought he was crazy. We hadn't even got to the where he's a young man in the temple. Okay, that's a whole nother different conundrum. Like, how did you not know? I mean, did the angel not tell you? Like, come on. So there's a lot of problems.
That's a great point, actually. So the when he's 12 or whatever in the temple as a young boy, and they said, well, we didn't understand what you were saying, and we did. It's as though they had no idea that this guy was going to be a special, like, Messiah type figure. Like, the whole miraculous birth had just been just a crazy dream or something they've forgotten, and he's just a normal kid. And when he does something crazy, they're like, well, we weren't expecting that. It's like, well, do you not remember? Like 12 years ago? Like,
it's like, hey, I'm the kid who can make wine out of just water. Don't forget.
Yeah. And you were a virgin, don't you know? I mean, at least if you take Luke to some degree, sometimes depends on how you view this. We got a super chat, and I don't want to jump ahead, but I suspect we're going to cover this. Doc Pleroma, thank you for the super chat, helping support the channel. Anybody who super chats, I'll be happy to try and get your questions asked. Matthew mentioned 4 loose women in the genealogy. Remaining pre-virgin birth polemic of Joe's paternity, but still being Messiah worthy. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is this the idea that Mary may have slept around, or am I mistaken?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. So there are some women in his genealogy, which is problematic.
Yeah,
which
and
we will come on
the 4 women that are mentioned all have what we might consider sexual indiscretions.
Yeah, they're not like matriarchal figures. Yeah.
Yeah, and usually how they either they had weird ways that they became pregnant, or they were in a line of work where that was a bit strange. So, for example, Ruth, how she gets pregnant basically by getting Boaz drunk and then sleeping with him. We have, of course, we have Rahab, who was a prostitute, Bathsheba, with all the story there of how basically David did all sorts of not so good things to, be with her. And I'm forgetting the 4th woman earlier on, who also had to pretend to be a prostitute so that way she could
the daughter-in-law of Judah. And she ends up taking a staff or a signet. I can't remember, but either way, the point was, she ended up sleeping and getting pregnant by him because his other sons either they spilt the seed on the earth, or they wouldn't get her pregnant, or couldn't get her pregnant, or refused to, whatever it might be. Yeah, all 4 of them are like this. Is this Matthew saying, hey, Jesus's mother? This Kelsis thing, if you wanted to argue, it's jumping the gun, but
yeah, and we'll definitely come on to that as well. I mean, I think to go back, it's quite useful to just show what Justin Martyr said, and we will answer that question a little bit more as we go on. But Justin Martyr said, it is quite true that some people of our kind acknowledge him to be Christ, but at the same time declare him to have been a man of men. I, however, cannot agree with them, and I will not do so, even if the majority of Christians insist on this opinion and impart it to me. For by Christ ourselves we have been commanded to base our conclusions not on human teachings, but on predictions set forth by the blessed prophets and imparted by his own teaching. This is really interesting, the idea that actually the majority of Christians at the time appear to believe that Christ was not born of a virgin. This was maybe fanciful thinking or whatever. So I suppose the question is, why would the gospel writers want him to be born of a virgin? I mean, what's the importance there?
Well, am I giving your book away? Is this something I need to do? You want me to answer it? Because your book answers that.
And Aaron. And
well, I'll let Aaron. I host all the time. You guys do some of the heavy lifting for me, because I'm always the one jibber jabbering here.
Well, there is one interesting detail with the genealogy that we get from Jesus, besides the 4 women that, as we already mentioned, kind of stand out. And Matthew is highlighting these 4 women. All the other people mentioned the genealogy are men, but among those men, so we're following like the line of David, and we get to, I'm forgetting which king it is, but basically right at the end of like a free Judah before being taken over by the Babylonians, and God basically cursing that line, and nowhere from that king will, no one from that line, will be the will ever rule over Israel. Considering Joseph isn't actually the father, this is an interesting way to make it so Jesus is in the lineage of David without being genetically connected, by basically being adopted by Joseph, so he can still be Davidic without having that curse. I think there's some cleverness on the part of that.
Oh, that's interesting. I've never considered that before. And again, this is something we're going to come and talk on a little bit later when we deal with the genealogies explicitly. But yeah, that's interesting. That could be a get out of jail free card.
The other thing you mentioned in your book was the simple fact that you had literally the rulers of Israel, the Romans, who had these special births. If you weren't just looking at other gods, let's say, because that's also a parallel. You open your book with this, Jonathan, and you give a chart and talk about how, if I may, in on your book page 30, you talk about, Prometheus, Perseus, all these different gods that someone else wrote about, and having been male, lived in a pre-Christian time, had God for a father, or a god for a father, had a human virgin for a mother, had their birth announced by a heavenly display, had their birth announced by celestial music, been born about roughly the winter solstice, December 25th-ish, had an attempt on their life by a tyrant while they were still an infant, met with violent death, rose again from the dead. Almost all were believed to have been visited by wise men during infancy, fasted for 40 days as an adult. Now, I don't know if all of this is factual, the data in particular. Would you say that what this guy's saying is factual? He has source material to back up all these claims?
Well, I think these motifs are super, super common, right?
Right.
And there's absolutely no doubt about that. You've got to. So it's going back to why would the authors want Jesus to be born a virgin?
Right.
And I think the first thing you've got to say is that they want Jesus to be more special than his counterparts, the people he's competing with, which is primarily Caesar Augustus, right? And then all these other divine entities from the pantheons and the cultures around. So whether that be Greek, Roman, or ancient Near East, or whatever. So Jesus has to be able to compete, and also with other Jewish figures as well. It's really important that Jesus how was Moses born? Well, let's have Jesus being a little bit more special than that. So it's about having a miraculous birth. So if Caesar Augustus has a miraculous birth, well, flaming heck, Jesus has to have a miraculous birth.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that Caesar Augustus is called Divi Filius or Dei Filius, which means, the son of God or divine, divine being of God. So Jesus is not only competing in his birth, but also in his name, in trumping the claims of Caesar Augustus, because he has to be special. And how do you get a special person? Well, let's start off with having a special birth.
I agree.
And I know a lot of people poke holes in comparative mythology, but these special births are pretty myth a penny. They are common motif in any kind of story, mythological story, right? So this isn't unusual. And in fact,
Justin Barber himself says it's the same sort of thing. You've got he says, you pagans, you've been believing the same sorts of things, so we're no different from you. If Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century can say they're the same story, how are we justified in saying no, there's absolutely no comparison?
That's a great quote from Justin Martyr. I can't remember, is it on the resurrection or something? He where he basically says, so when Christians say, "Oh, Jesus must be true," like the Gospels must be true because he's so different from all these other existent, religious entities or mythic entities or whatever. So he's so different from them that it must be true. And then you have Justin Martyr saying, "Hey, our Jesus is no different from all your special guys." And so they're like modern apologists are like, "Oh no, that's a real problem." I don't know if I quote John Dominic Crossan in his book, The Birth of Christianity, because I think it's a really nice quote that sums up quite a lot here, which is, to quote him, page 287 to 289. Augustus came from a miraculous conception by the divine and human conjunction of the god Apollo and his mother Adair. How does the historian respond to that story? Are there any who take it literally? That divergence raises an ethical problem for me. Either all such divine conceptions from Alexander to Augustus and from the Christ to the Buddha should be accepted literally and miraculously, or all of them should be accepted metaphorically and theologically. It is not morally acceptable to say our story is truth and yours is myth, ours is history and yours is a lie. It is even less morally acceptable to say that indirectly and covertly by manufacturing defensive or protective strategies that apply only to one's own story. And it's such a good quote, that. It's to say, it's basically don't special plead, don't have double standards. If you claim that your obviously mythological miraculous birth is true, and you're going to come up with loads of defensive strategies to assert or to back up that claim that that's true, then why aren't you doing that for all these other cases? And why are they all obviously false and yours is so obviously true, supposedly?
And that's that's a very honest statement, right? Like, go ahead and become Baha'i and say everything's true. Everybody was a prophet, and every religion was saying these were all true, and they were all different epochs and times and regions where the elephant, so to speak, from the blind men was revealing himself. I mean, that's a better position than to pretend this one's true. I used to believe that. You're like looking at me 9-10 years ago when you say that, because I was doing that. I was saying, no, Jesus is the true one. Everything else was a lie. None of that stuff is true. Only this one. Shut up. Listen to this. The way, the truth, the life. No one can get to I did the whole, and it was something that you could not get me out of that thinking. I was stuck trying to convince everyone, especially those closest to me. Like, I can't imagine how much harassment I had put on my family from literally trying to shove this down their throats.
How did you ever harmonize the two accounts? I mean, we haven't talked about how different they are yet, but how did you as a Christian, did you ever really worry yourselves with the nativity accounts? Did you ever analyze them?
I never analyzed them critically. I never tried to see if there were holes in it. I heard people try to say there's two different genealogies, and I had no problem when Christians would say stuff like, well, these are two different, talking about the family line of Joseph or the family line of Mary, or try to come up with some. There was always an excuse. I always had one. And I went with that. Like, if it was the least probable or the least likely thing to be the case, if it was a way out to keep the rest of my building standing, to me, keep in mind, this isn't just psychological. This was like, when I deconverted, it was experiencing a death. So if your family member is on a dying deathbed and there's a way that you think you can save them, you're going to do it. That's how I viewed Jesus, my relationship to the faith, my relationship to the story, and my attachment. I would do anything I can to keep it alive and not let it die at all cost, even if cognitive dissonance was what was required. I would do it. It was only till I almost died from drug addiction that actually allowed me to start thinking outside that box. So
may I also throw something a little bit empirical as well, because I want to try to give things the best shot it can. So if we suppose our two gospel accounts are completely independent, they're not using each other, they don't have a common source besides the Holy Family. Since Matthew and Luke both mention the virgin birth, some people say, independent attestation, therefore it's historical. I would like to also point out that we probably wouldn't believe that even if we can justify that, because there have been studies or surveys of young women in hospitals, and a significant percentage of them are literally giving birth and saying they never had sex. So there are either literally tens of thousands of virgin births every year around the world, or you literally can't actually believe such a miracle claim even when you are getting it directly from the source. If we cannot literally believe someone on the hospital bed claiming she never had sex, how can we believe someone decades later just because two people happen to both be saying the same thing? That's the best case scenario.
To compound that problem is not believe. So when you say we don't believe the mother in this case in the hospitals, it's not that we don't believe the mother here. We don't believe someone writing at least 40 years later.
Yeah, like I say, even best case scenario, even if we had a tape recorder shot back in time, asked Mary directly, we still would have reason to not believe that.
Yeah. I mean, what would be the approach? If a doctor who's about to, deliver your baby, and you come in and you say, listen, I got pregnant and I never did anything with anybody, and this is a virgin birth, the doctor, if he's going to take her seriously, is either going to say, okay, she was either completely out and doesn't know it, okay, and someone took advantage of her, or, there's literally the brain will put you into an hallucination sometimes when you're being raped or something like that. So you wouldn't even know it. There's people who said angels appeared to them. They were actually in a very traumatic situation from a violent rape act or something like that. And here they are pregnant and they don't even know what happened to them because the brain protects them from things like that. So they may not even know what actually happened to them, or you could be in a drunken stupor and not remember, or whatever it might be. The point is sure, you can listen, but you don't just take that. And what's amazing? Christians would agree with us. in any other circumstance. But since it's Mary and since it's Jesus, don't you talk about my Jesus.
I think that's a good segue onto the idea that Mary goes, "Oh, do you know what, Joseph? Turns out I'm pregnant." And Joseph goes, Was it Peter? Was it Rob? Was it Harry? No. She goes, "No, it turns out it was God." And he's like, "Oh, okay, fair enough." There you go. Really, really like gullibly.
This begs the question. I just want to make one mention, Jonathan, is the book I'm reading right now by Francesca Stravacapoulou. And that's like the Greek way of pronouncing her last name. But she is talking about God has a body. Yes. So this is the big question. We know that God becoming spirit in the sense that we think and does not have a physical body. We know that comes later on. The Hebrew Bible is like, it's spelled all over that God is like physical, has a body, sits on a throne, has a whole family of sons of God, etc. Elohim, if you will. It makes me wonder, because the Greek god Zeus would come down and mate with women, whatever. It makes me really wonder if that notion of what Francesca's talking about has found its way into the New Testament, that God actually has overshadowed, and this is kind of what would it be, a euphemism for God actually impregnating her, just like the other gods.
Yeah, it's just that, you look at Zeus and his golden shower for Danae. You got Perseus being born of that kind of thing way. So yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, there's heaps of precedents for this. So one of the counter arguments we hear from Jews, we hear from Celsus. So he was a Jewish polemicist who was arguing. We only know of him through, not through his original documents, unfortunately, but just by Christian counter arguments against him. But he was arguing that there was a Roman soldier called Pantera who fathered the actual, historical Jesus, and this is kind of like a Jewish counter argument. You could really imagine, because there's a sort of thing I would say, which is like, am I going to believe that A, you've been immaculately impregnated by God, or B, a Roman soldier and you got it on? I know what has a better precedence and which has better inductive reasoning to defend it. So you can understand why that argument came about. And some skeptics will give that good credibility, but you've got to be careful here, because you can't have, on the one hand, yes, Pantera, this kind of theory going on of being fathered by a Roman soldier, and then say it's a mistranslation of virgin, which we're going to talk about now. And I don't think either of them kind of work. I think you've got to go for one or the other. Because if you don't have a mistranslation of virgin, you have no issues with virgin, which is to say that there was no explanation for how she got impregnated. So you don't need to say it was a Roman soldier, because the virgin thing's not a problem. So
before you get into that definition, if I could just make one comment that Steve Mason said when I recently interviewed him. I asked him about the maternal and paternal lines, which we'll get into that later as you discuss the position. He points out that the reason why they would go with the woman, in especially during the Roman time, Hellenistic time, is that oftentimes women were raped. And when they were raped and you didn't know who the paternal line was, which would mess up genealogies and everything, they went ahead and just started making the mother's line the significant line, because you can almost be certain that that child came from the woman who birthed it. You can't deny that as much as you could who's the father. So he brought up that rape in this time, especially like prisoners of war, you name it, were almost certain to have been raped and would get pregnant by people that weren't necessarily from a genealogy that they might have wanted it to be from. So then it was from the mother's line. Just throwing it out there, as if you take the Celsus view, then, there's still a way to try and make that work. But getting into the definition, I apologize, I had to make note.
Yeah, so it's probably worth talking about the very famous problem of the mistranslation of the word virgin. And the idea here is that you've got the Hebrew Bible, and then you've got the translation into Greek called the Septuagint. So the Septuagint is this supposedly miraculous like Genesis of the Greek Bible, where they put 72 different people in 72 different rooms and they all came up with the same Greek translation for the Bible. So obviously we've got dubious Genesis there. But there are certain words that are poorly translated. And one of those words here, so one of them being in Psalm 22, is it, where we talked about pierced hands. We talked about it in one of the resurrection videos, and it's actually not pierced hands. It's actually a mistranslation from the Hebrew, which should be pinned by a lion type thing. Anyway, here's another example, which is the word Parthenos, which is a Greek word, and in the original Hebrew Bible it's Alma, but Alma means generic young woman, but Parthenos, the Greek word, means specifically a virgin, or more likely means a virgin. So you've got whoever translated it into Greek is changing the meaning from a young woman to virgin. And then Matthew and Luke are coming back and looking at these so-called prophecies and extracting them and throwing them at Jesus. But if they're going to look at that and say, well, this means he has to be born of a virgin, then they are literally making up a story whereby he's given a virgin conception. But that is based on a mistranslation of the word. In other words, that prophecy never said that in the first place, which throws a whole thing. I mean, if this one argument holds, then it's a really, really big problem for the entire nativity story. What does anyone have anything to add to that at all?
Aaron?
I don't know how much we'll also get into the Parthenos Pantera thing, the attack that Jesus, was the product of Mary being a rape victim because of a Roman soldier by that name of Pantera. Though it sounds like they're trying to pun on the Greek word Parthenos. I would think, like, if it were a modern case of someone saying, no, I conceived through magical means, I'm a Parthenos, it'd be more like us responding, more like Joseph failed the paternity test.
Yeah, right.
That's what it sounds like to me.
Interesting.
So what the word that should have been, in Hebrew, the claim is that if you wanted a virgin, you'd much more likely use the word Betula, which is more closely means a virgin, but not explicitly again. And when it gets even worse though. So I think the quote is from Isaiah 7:14, right? And the prophecy actually refers to King Ahaz. And like we talked about before, Derek, with regard to the resurrection prophecies that clearly weren't prophecies, is that these are verses that are extracted out of context. And when you look at the whole of in this case, Isaiah 7, it doesn't apply at all to Jesus. So when you talk about, curds and honey and all these kind of things, none of it can be applied to Jesus. So you can't just extract that and say he needs to be born of a virgin. Well, yeah, okay, if you're going to say that, then you need all that rest of this to also apply to Jesus, but it doesn't. None of it applies to Jesus, and it's completely contextual to King Ahaz and that's the rest of Isaiah 7. It's a really big problem.
Yeah, they were modern, like, fortune cookie type people in the first century. I mean, they're looking for what speaks to them at the time, it seems, and they're gleaning any bit of information and finding a way to concoct the narrative where that happens. That's the way it seems to me. Good point. And also the whole, maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, but this is in the vein of what you're talking about. King Ahaz, his wife, she's the one addressed here as this Alma, okay, this young woman. He's married to her, and anyone who knows how that works, the Bible tells you how this works. When you get married, you have sex that night, okay? It is not like, all right, we're going to wait a couple of years after we get married to decide to do these things. They concede that, well, not concede, but necessarily, but they went ahead and made that covenant happen that night they got married. She was married to him and being called an Alma. She couldn't have been a virgin. This is absolutely without a doubt. She could not be a virgin. What the author of the New Testament might be doing is a whole nother question.
And I'm going to read you another quote. This is from Tom Stark. Tom Stark, who wrote a brilliant book that's freely available online. He released it as a free PDF called "God is a Moral Compromiser," which is a refutation of literalists of Paul Copan's book "God is a Moral Monster." Tom Stark's, he's kind of disappeared of late. I don't know what he's doing, but he's got some brilliant stuff. This is a quote from "The Human Faces of God: What Scripture Reveals When It Gets God Wrong and Why Inerrancy Tries to Hide It." Page 28. So the point is moot. Even if Isaiah did mean virgin, he was not predicting a miraculous birth. This is what you were saying, actually, Derek. If the woman had been a virgin at the time Isaiah uttered the prophecy, she would not have been by the time she had conceived the child. However, the verb here, to conceive, hurrah, is in the perfect tense, which means it is a completed action. The best translation of the verse would reflect that the young woman was already pregnant, that Isaiah was predicting the child's gender and directing her how to name him. Look, he says, this young pregnant woman is going to have a son, and she shall name him Emmanuel. So the idea is that it's wrong. It's wrong on several levels. So it's wrong because it's a mistranslation, and even if it was meaning virgin, it's still wrong in how it interprets how virgin would be being used in this context. So it's just wrong. Like Jesus wouldn't have been born of a virgin, or could have been born of a virgin, but it's got sod all to do with Isaiah 7.
Yeah. And the remainder of that prophecy, if you just keep reading in Isaiah, by the end of the next chapter, the prophecy is already fulfilled. The child grows up enough, the Assyrian kings are pushed back. Everything that Isaiah was predicting in chapter 7 is done by chapter 8. There's no reason one has to wait 60 books later to see it's done.
Thank you so much.
Double dipping into the prophecy there, yeah.
John Gear, thank you so much for the super chat. He says Catholics believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary. And that's a whole nother. I'd love to get your thoughts, because we don't actually address that in your book. Maybe get your thoughts on what is, in your estimation, where this is coming from and why. If you have an idea, that'll be fun to get into. But thank you so much for the support, John. I always appreciate it. Thank you, everybody who's super chatted.
I'm not a hugely knowledgeable on Catholic sort of catechism and exegesis and so on and so forth. I don't know if Aaron's got anything to add here, other than it's a way of making her more saintly and this kind of perfect, increasing her into this level of semi-divinity that I think she has.
I wonder if it's I'm thinking a little later. I'm wondering when Kelsis comes out with this bombshell of a book trying to talk about how she was not, pure and things like that. If this was a development of making Mary, it's almost like Songs of Solomon? It's all about nudity and things like that. And Dr. Price pointed out that Jews made that the most holy book of the Bible because it was the most prohibited, and everyone's like, oh, this is so materialistic and about a woman's breast and this and that. No, it's God and his covenant with Israel, and like, this is the most holy book. It's almost like a reaction to maybe Kelsis type polemics. I don't know. I don't know anything about it. I just wonder if they're making Mary more on purpose to keep her pure, so that the Son of God is pure. We got to have her 100% sinless, so he is 100%
yes,
sinless.
That's a really important point. So she has to have that sinless purity. It's guilt by association, isn't it? So if Jesus's mother is some kind of has some dubious background, then it casts aspersions upon Jesus.
Right. And it's worth noting, in the later gospel accounts, the ones that don't make it into the Bible, where the concept of the Immaculate Conception comes about, people confuse it with the virgin birth, where Mary is born without sin. She is pure and holy right from the get-go. Of course, begging the question, if Mary's sin nature can just be shut off, then it seems like there's a knob God can touch and take care of all 7 billion of us right now. So hellfire makes no sense just from that. But besides the theological nightmare that creates, it starts setting up the idea that she's perfect, she's pure, she's holy right from the get-go. And that sex stuff is icky. So there's no way she could have ever have done that. And the what's usually called like the Mariology, just like Christology, how high up Catholics particular think of her just gets higher and higher. It's usually also a Catholic tradition that the woman in Revelation 12, the one who is up in heaven, clothed with the sun, giving birth, that's supposed to be Mary, giving birth to Jesus, apparently in heaven. So yeah, she's just like Dogecoin. She's gone to the moon.
Yeah,
I'm not recommending anyone to buy cryptocurrencies. Please, let's not get that. Stay that out of the comments.
So I think going from the Virgin, the next sort of port of call here would be to talk about, I have a short chapter in the book on the male genome, because I find it philosophically quite interesting. Because you get this idea that Jesus has to be fully man and fully God. The idea of his ontological status, I think is very interesting, because when you say, and we are supposed to aspire to be like Jesus, but how can we do that when it appears half of his genome has appeared magically? And if it's appeared magically, then how did it get there? Is it random? Obviously not, surely not, because if you're going to have random bits of DNA in you, you're not going to be some sinless wonder kid. Okay, so God has decided what half of his DNA is, right? So he fused it with Mary's egg somehow magically, and half of her and her DNA, so that we have this Jesus that I don't think that you have any right to call fully man, because he's been designed in a way where he's sinless. I would argue. I just think there's huge amounts of problems in the Holy Trinity anyway. I mean, not Holy Trinity, in the fully man, fully God thing. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. But when you've got like God throwing in the DNA there, it's properly problematic. And, Hebrews 2:17 says, therefore he had to be made like his brethren in all things. Well, he's not like his brethren in all things, because actually God appears to have created half of his DNA magically, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in all things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. Not too sure that works. I don't know.
I will say this: if someone's going to get miraculously pregnant and they don't want to tonight, if they don't like this video, there's over 450 people watching right now. And it's not only that, there are curses and plagues, all that stuff from the good book that's going to come down if you don't make that like button happen. Just a short plug. Anyway, one thing I would say, Jonathan, is this. That's why I threw that whole Francesca thing in the mix, because I wonder if when they authored these, the idea of God still having a body, which would mean God's literally has seed. He has actual children. He has sons. I wonder if by the time the New Testament's being written, if that notion is still there. Now, I know Christians would be like, what are you saying? I don't even understand. If you didn't watch what I said before briefly, if you haven't read God and Anatomy by Francesca Stravacapoulou, then you probably wouldn't know what I'm talking about. But it's the idea that God has a physical body. He's seated on a throne in the heaven above the solid firmament, while they're on this flat earth, according to the cosmology in the Bible. And he comes down and he overshadows Mary. Some way he sleeps with Mary in some sense, I guess. It doesn't say that. I'm just making the point.
I think the contemporary understanding of how genetics works or how biology works was obviously pretty stunted. The understanding of how the whole biology of reproduction took place was woefully inadequate as an accurate representation of reality. The Greeks had done some thinking on the subject. The preformationists believed that the father was like the plough and the mother the field. This meant that the seed and all the genetic material was delivered by the father, and the mother merely providing the milieu in which the development took place. So if you don't understand how genetics takes place, then you can create a story like this and never have to think about, well, how does it work? How does it work in the minutiae? But of course, now we understand how biology works, and things like that are a little bit problematic.
On top of that, because most people will be, balking at the idea that God has a body, has semen, has all those things. So if one wants to claim that's all metaphor, if we take that for granted, then we have a biological problem. Jesus should have been a clone of Mary. If there's no other sources of DNA, what should be coming out of Mary's womb should be a carbon copy of Mary, because that's how actual parthenogenesis works in the real world. For what species actually do reproduce that way, it's basically cloning. And at least I believe more often than not, they're using the male pronoun for Jesus. So unless we're going to invent many more steps of interpretation on top of this, no, there's a total lack of understanding of the biology involved here.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because some people do, for some reason, want to point to biology and the existence of parthenogenesis in other species as if to say, yeah, well, it could happen. I don't know why, as a Christian, I would ever want to point to that. I mean, this is clearly miraculous. But if you're going to say that, then yeah, it's a clone. And so Mary gives birth to another Mary. Oh, no, it's Jesus. Oh, no, that doesn't work.
This, an interesting, fun fact I've learned as I've been delving into Islam is that Muslims believe that he was born of a virgin too. So you're you're shooting yourself in the foot by accepting this as well. And it's like, this is one of the most easy places to reveal a problem: the genealogies, the fact that he's virgin birth, etc. And it takes down not only the Christian idea, of course, but also Islam's understanding of Jesus.
Yeah, and genealogies is where we're at now. So genealogies are a huge problem, because if you didn't think there were problems already, and you don't see there are problems further on from this, then the genealogies are a very clear problem, because one genealogy has 77 and the other doesn't names in it. One's like almost half the size of the other genealogy. So something weird is going on here.
You even talk about how they removed names, like just so they could be theological, or better put, numerological, right? So numbers have meaning. They removed genealogical names from the list. It's like you can go back and read the Hebrew Bible and they've erased some of these names.
Yeah. So that has happened previously in the Hebrew Bible. There is some precedence for that, but it just shows it's not historically accurate.
Exactly.
But then when you say, well, Luke has 77 names in his genealogy. Now that's really interesting, because 7 is a really important number. It's got numerological symbolism and importance. And he's got 11 sets of 7 there. So that's clearly he's doing something. That means that any time like symbolism is taking the forefront, accuracy is taking a back seat. And that's broadly, I think, what we can say, especially when you have two accounts here that are so vastly different. You've got the Messiah is supposed to be of Solomon's line, we hear in the Hebrew Bible, but Jesus is not. He comes in Luke's genealogy through Nathan, who's Solomon's brother. So that comes from 1 Chronicles 22:9. So you got that's a little bit of a problem. So does that mean that we can start throwing away some of the Old Testament claims? Does now Christianity contradict the Old Testament? Does the New Testament contradict it? Is that what's going on here? Then Matthew has 3 lots of 14, which are again factors of 7. 14 is important because it's a gematria of David. A gematria means it's like a numerical value of a word, of a name. So David's name, has a value of 14. So Matthew has 3 lots of 14. So the theory would go. But he's then omitted a load of names. He's omitted 3 names from an Old Testament genealogy that's there. Again, this is disagreeing, contradicting an Old Testament genealogy.
Mm-hmm.
And there's only one Jeconiah where there should be 2. So is he losing names for numerical reasons? Is he trying to I need these numbers, so you can go. And he's got a whole lot less than he's got 30 odd less than or fewer names than Luke. So I don't know. What do you guys think?
And also on top of all that, when Matthew has his genealogy, he says, look, 14, 14, 14, and then you go and count, and he's missing one.
Yeah.
When you make all this fuss about numbers and then it literally doesn't add up. And this is just counting. This is not high level math. This is not, a geometric proof. This is counting.
Yeah. So that's Jeconiah to Jesus. That's the last one. I think has only got 13.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I definitely think there's a purposeful theological intention in this. So I hope that fundamentalists that are watching this will take a second to actually go and examine and see if Jonathan's right. Go test and see if he's lying. Go see if 3 names are omitted in the Matthew genealogy, for example, when you look at the Hebrew Bible. Why are they leaving things out? Things
like Aaron said, so Jeconiah, according to Jeremiah 22, 24 to 30, there's a curse of Jeconiah, which means that his offspring all the way down a curse. So and should not be able to be the Messiah. Effectively, they're cursed. But Jesus is part of that genealogy, part of that ancestry. So how does that work? Well, then Christians had to go and say, well, it only lasted Jeconiah's life. But then what's that to say that his seed is cursed if it only lasts his life? This is like a pointless thing to say. And the same with the difference in numbers in the genealogies. Christians will say, well, one of them is a matrilineal genealogy and the other one's a patrilineal genealogy.
Right. That's what I used to think.
But the problem is there's no evidence of this ever happening in the Jewish world. Like, so it's like, yeah, you can say that, but you've got absolutely no right to say that.
But Jonathan, 3 is 1 and 1 is 3. Don't you know? Yeah, we'll say anything. We really will to try and keep the story true. I do want to give a shout out. Jimmy Martinez, thanks for the super chat. He says, Joel Osteen is the second coming. He's the second coming. He's the real Messiah. You know what, man? You might be right, especially with all that money in the wall. If I was there, I'd probably call him that too after I took that money home. But yeah. Thank you for the super chat. I really do appreciate the support, Jimmy.
I mean, I've written a whole I've written articles on the matrilineal claim and how it just doesn't stand up. I mean, it's probably not worth going into. It gets a bit sort of dull, and we need to move it on. But the claim that one of them is a matrilineal genealogy simply doesn't hold up to any kind of scrutiny at all. But these are the sort of things I have to do, which is try and provide the least probable explanation for the data, rather than say these contradict. I mean, the obvious thing, the prima facie thing to say is, look at these two genealogies. They don't agree. At least one of them's wrong, right? That's what any human being would say that in any other context. You wouldn't go, they can't be wrong. No, right. They have to be right. How can they be right? They've got different names. They've got different number of names. Okay, one of them is a genealogy through the mother. There you go. But then the problem is that doesn't really work. I said I won't talk about this too much, but here's one problem. One of them's got half the number of names than the other. So if they're both giving you the same chronology of time, then one of them has people living twice as long as everyone else than in the other genealogy. And actually, when you look at the genealogy, I think in Matthew particularly, if you work out the time, because we do have certain names that we can put dates to, and you say from this name to Jesus is this number of generations, 13 generations, I think, Jeconiah. So we can benchmark Jeconiah and say it's 13 generations to here, which means, oh dear, that's like 50 years for each generation. That can't work. That's like an average generation, 25 years tops, right? So people are living twice as long as we know they did for each and every one of those people in that 13 name genealogy. It just doesn't work. So it's not plausible at all, which means you're not presenting a historical genealogy. You are doing something theological here or symbolic. And of course, Matthew includes some women as well, which is also rather problematic. Even if you say, so one's matrilineal, the other's patrilineal, but one of them includes some women. Like, what is going on here?
Why is it not women all the way back? You're mixing it up.
Yes. So does anyone have anything to say on genealogies at all?
I just want to mention the funny thing about 14. I didn't realize that the gematria of David was 14, but I also just Hebrew narratives. You see Jacob serve for 7 years for his love, Rachel, but doesn't get her. He gets Leah. So he ends up getting Leah pregnant, has kids with Leah, and then has to wait another 7 years. So there's just obviously 7 and doubled that. So 14 plays a significant role. So I suspect it's theological. But yeah, that's all
over the Bible. Numbers like 40, 7. It's just all numbers. So whenever the number 40 is mentioned or the number 12, you can almost guarantee it's not reflecting something that was like 40 years in the desert. There's no way these guys lived 40 years in the desert wandering themselves around a wilderness, right? So this is clearly symbolic.
Absolutely.
Bethlehem is a right old problem. Bethlehem is a huge problem. And it's a problem because, so here's the thing. Luke and Matthew, I think know that Jesus is Jesus of Nazareth, right? I think so. I'm a historicist, but a very sort of nominal one. In fact, by point of fact that I think Jesus existed as a human who was an itinerant preacher, and he was from Nazareth, and then he went to Jerusalem and said some stuff that pissed people off and got executed. There you go. That's the story of Jesus, and then everything else is myth. But I think that there's this common understanding that Jesus was Jesus of Nazareth. And you could argue that may have been itself like a prophecy to do with Nazarene, Nazarite, and all these kind of like words as well. So, and we can talk about that later. But I think Jesus was Jesus of Nazareth, and Luke and Matthew thought, right, we've got a problem here because we're going back through the Old Testament, and it looks like the Messiah needs to be born in Bethlehem. How do we do this? How do we get Jesus of Nazareth living as an adult in Nazareth, but down to Bethlehem to be born? And Luke and Matthew have two completely different ways that are contradictory. Luke has a census that requires Joseph for some strange reason, and we're probably not going to get time to talk about that today, the census. That's a whole video in itself. But he gets Jesus down to Bethlehem to be born by having Joseph have to go from Nazareth to Bethlehem for a census that he never would have had to go to. And he takes his 9-month pregnant wife down there, and they give birth in Bethlehem and go straight back from Bethlehem to Jerusalem to get Jesus circumcised, and then to sacrifice a couple of doves, and then go to Nazareth. Right, so it's Nazareth, Bethlehem, straight back to Jerusalem and Nazareth. That's Luke's story. Matthew has them already living in Bethlehem. He then has 3 wise men following a star. Aaron knows a lot about this. He has 3 wise men following a star where they go to Jerusalem, kind of lose the star a bit. And then this is a way of them picking up Herod, because Matthew wants this to be a retelling of the Moses story and the murder of the death of the firstborn with the Moses scenario. And he needs Herod to be the new Pharaoh. So he has the Magi losing the star in Jerusalem, picking up Herod. Herod then goes down to Bethlehem, slaughters a bunch of children in the hope that he kills Jesus. And Joseph and Mary and Jesus get warned about this and run off to Egypt for 2 years and come back after Herod has died. And Matthew gets him back to Nazareth by saying that they wanted a safe place to live, basically, and Nazareth was a safe place for them to go. So they went back to Nazareth. So those 2 stories are massively different. And there's no way you could have the Luke story and forget to mention the king of the country trying to murder children, chasing them out so they're political refugees for 2 years, and then coming back after 2 years to live in a different place. That doesn't fit into Luke's story at all. But anyway, there's your 2 stories. But the problem is Bethlehem. So these 2 gospel authors need the kid to be born in Bethlehem. Discuss.
Real quick question before we get the super chat, and then I'd love to get Aaron's thoughts on this. A person asks in the chat, is it really pronounced Bethlehem? Is that a British thing? So we say Bethlehem. We just say it's from Bethlehem.
You pronounce almost everything wrong, though. So
yeah, I kind of figured you would say that
and spell them wrong.
I knew you would say that. Doc Pleuromanot, thank you for the super chat. He says Codex Bazai of Luke 2:6 has Mary give birth while they were going. Same in Proto G of James. What's up with this outside of Bethlehem tradition? How about you guys have any idea about this?
Oh, little town of Bethlehem. That's how you sing it. If we want to sing some hymns. That's a good question. And in fact, there's quite a few traditions about Jesus being born in a cave. And we find this from some of the early church fathers, which is then we also see in one of the churches being built on top of a cave of being supposedly where Jesus was born. But you do get these competing traditions about whether he's born, in a barn, in a stable next to an inn, or was he born in a house? Because actually Matthew records him being born in a house, or at least the inference is it's in a house. And then you get this early tradition that he was born in a cave outside of Bethlehem. So, yeah, it's a problem.
Thank you so much, Doc, for the super chat. I appreciate the love. 525 people watching. Hit that like button. All right. Aaron.
So, yeah, Aaron.
Yeah, so I want to add to this and make it even worse than that, because the whole point of them trying to get to Bethlehem is to fulfill the alleged prophecy derived from whatever proof text to get that there. So the whole story of how they're getting there, why they're there, we see it's motivated reasoning. I would point out, though, if we continue with that line of logic, it gets even worse, because according to Matthew, there's supposed to be a prophecy that Jesus was supposed to come from Nazareth as well, that he's supposed to be a Nazarene. So there's another prophecy. And Matthew decides to make it even worse than that and said there's also prophecy that the Messiah is supposed to first start bringing the light of the world to the Galilee. He actually makes a quote of this in chapter 4 of Matthew. So it seems like every single place he's supposed to step foot is allegedly confirmed by prophecy, which basically means if we doubt the Bethlehem thing, we also have to doubt, even where he grew up. I would say that we can't even be certain about that, because there's apparently also a theological reason for him to be a Galilean. Everything's bad.
Yeah, and it's what happens when you go back to the Hebrew Bible and you try and find as many things that predict a Messiah, supposedly, and then you throw them all at Jesus, and then Jesus is supposed to be all these things. It's like, okay, I've got this puzzle where I need Jesus to be here, 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 this, that. He's a lamb, but he's a this, he's a that, and and it becomes a bit of a problem.
Yeah, there's so many interesting points you brought up, Aaron. There, we're tackling so many good things, and it sounds to be very theological. So no matter what position you take, historical Jesus, non-historical Jesus, doesn't matter. At the end of the day, I think that my recent interview I did with Robin Walsh, right? She came on and was like, "These are literary, these gospels are literary." I don't think people get what that means. So she's actually going further and saying divorce the community idea that it's attached to a community and this author's writing to a specific community, but they're competing elites writing a better narrative. So at the end of the day, it's all theological. It's the point, or at least an embellishment in a narrative and not literal history. So
the problem is the prophecy is from Micah 5:2, right? And as D.F. Strauss says in The Life of Jesus, all the way back in 1860, he says the entire context showed the meaning to be not that the expected governor who was to come forth out of Bethlehem would actually be born in that city, but only that he would be a descendant of David, whose family sprang from Bethlehem. So actually, this is an argument that they get the prophecy wrong, in that he doesn't need to be born in Bethlehem. He just needs to be a Bethlehemite, genealogically speaking. And that's, that means it's all just, they've really cocked up.
Got a couple super chats, if you don't mind. Cool Edge, thank you so much. Cool J Ledge, thank you. Great show, Derek. Get Jonathan going on the census. Love listening to Dr. Adair talk about the Magi. Dr. Kill is everywhere. And he gave 666. Thank you so much, Cool. I appreciate it. Yeah, we got Dr. Kill in the house, so everybody might want to be on your best behavior, because let me tell you, he does do what his name says if you aren't a good boy and girl. He knows when you've been naughty or nice. I can tell you that for sure.
I have to say, I'm not scared because I have no life, so I can't be killed.
Well, look, I've already put a lamb's blood on my doorpost, so I don't think he'll be able to come through it. I don't want to push his buttons, though, and risk it, so I'm just going to be a good boy. I know everybody would agree with me on that. We also have a super chat from Aaron. Thank you so much for the super chat. Not having a proper biography of the most important person. I love this. Do I need to read the rest of it? I mean, really? I already love the way you started. Not having a proper biography of the most important person of history is very problematic and suspicious. Instead, snippets and contradicting, I think it means contradicting stories. Well put. I really agree with you on that. In fact, the reason I was so important, I'm not going there here. The reason I wanted to know if mythicism was true, if there really was a guy, is when you go from believing this is a literal guy who was born of a virgin, who died and rose again to take my personal sins somehow and took care of all of them so that I can go to heaven, and he's God in the flesh, to he may not have even existed. That's so people on the outside who were never Christian may not see how big that question really would explode in someone's mind. I felt that. So this is a wonderful super chat. I appreciate this. Excellent comment.
Just to go back to what Cool J Ledge said earlier, like I freaking love talking about the census. I could fill up like 3 hours talking about the census alone. We may or may not get to touch on this video, but it's such a huge topic and it blows Luke's claims out of the water. And Aaron loves talking about the Magi. So, but I think as we're talking about Bethlehem, it is more likely that we get onto the Magi. I think.
I'm excited. This gets into his book. It's down in the description. The Star of Bethlehem. I apologize, Jonathan. Bethlehem. And Aaron.
I never realized that there was a difference, but there you go.
Oh, yeah.
Honestly, actually, what one of the other British astronomers who also talks about the Star of Bethlehem a lot, when I hear him pronounce it, he'll say Bethlehem.
Well, I mean,
so, everyone's doing it wrong.
Okay. Well, no, Aaron, you're not quite right there. I'm doing it right. Everyone else is doing it wrong. But it's just a small correction.
You be careful. We won the last war. We're going to get the next one too.
Oh my goodness, it's gone there, has it? Oh dear. So I think one of the big problems for the Bethlehem claim, the claim that he's born in Bethlehem, and actually this is huge. I was rereading my book today because I've got, as I've told you, I've got primary progressive multiple sclerosis, so my memory isn't very good. So when I come to do these videos, I have to reread my own work because I just forget stuff. So apologies if I can't find certain words or certain ideas like tonight. That's my brain. I do apologize. But I was just reading the stuff on Bethlehem and how. And just I got blown away again. And the fact that Bethlehem doesn't appear in any of the Gospels after these two nativity accounts. Like, it is not mentioned. Like, you would think Paul or any of the Gospels would mention Bethlehem in the context of Jesus, given the miraculous nature of his birth, and given that Matthew claims the king of the bloomin' land chases him away after killing a bunch of innocent children, chases him away to another country to live for 2 years as a political refugee before coming back. And none of this is mentioned. Isn't that Bethlehem is not mentioned again by anyone? That's a big problem.
It's to put it very bluntly, it is theology. You've been saying this for a while. How many times does Matthew, I mean, it's early church fathers that admit this, they go with scripture. So Matthew has 2 donkeys. We're skipping ahead, but it's just to mention, we've already done this in our resurrection series. He has 2 donkeys. Mark has 1. Why would he have 2? Because he's going to the scripture. Yeah, he sees a Hebrew parallelism and probably mistakes it, assuming 2 instead of 1. There's other explanations people will try to go to, but this seems to be the most plausible. It makes the most sense to me. Either way, what does the scripture say? And that paints your narrative. Historical facts, who cares? It's what the scripture says. That's what it seems the gospel authors tend to do more often than not. So,
and when we look at, I'm going to say that strategy of what does the Old Testament say? That's what really happened. We see that same strategy for uncovering historical information well into the 2nd century. When Justin Martyr is going to try arguing about where the Magi, where the wise men come from, he's going to say they come from Arabia. Why does he do that? He goes through and he says, well, because of this verse from the Old Testament interpreted in this way, and if we take Damascus to actually mean this when Jesus is fighting demons, you see that he is actually trying to derive historical information from his personal interpretation of the Old Testament. He doesn't say, no, I'm getting this from Papias. No, I'm getting this from a gospel. It's like, no, I thunk this up and this is what really happened. And if he thinks that's totally valid for him to do, he clearly thinks that's okay for the gospel authors to do.
So I think, it's interesting when you go back and look at, say, Mark, where Mark has opportunities to mention Bethlehem, but he says, Mark 1:9, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Throughout the gospel, when visiting elsewhere, such as Capernaum, Mark 1:21-28, he's referred to as Jesus of Nazareth. I mean, you'd expect him to be Jesus of Bethlehem, right? But he's not called that. Mark 6, he returns to his hometown, which is Nazareth. 6:4, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his own relatives and in his own household. So this is the idea that everyone around Jesus appears to be coming from Nazareth. Now, if you believe Matthew, the idea is that he was already living, or the family was living in Bethlehem already, then you would expect there to be family and stuff, and that to be his hometown. That's clearly not the case.
Hey, we didn't touch on that super chat census. That was something I just was reminded. The census.
Well, yeah. So the census is such a massive thing. We will have to, I think, probably. Well, we'll see if we can get onto it later in the talk. Is that all right?
Okay, I'm down. I just want to let our audience know.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that. So do you have anything else to say about Bethlehem before we get onto like the Herod Bethlehem problem, Aaron?
I do want to provide what might be a good corrective to those who might have heard that Bethlehem didn't actually exist at the time of Jesus, that there was actually an article for this in Archaeology magazine like almost 20 years ago. And I tried digging into this myself because, this would obviously blow things out of the water if there literally wasn't a town. And it was actually being proposed by an archaeologist, not like the book arguing that Nazareth didn't exist. It was done by someone
the myth
who's
of Nazareth. That one.
Yeah.
Read it down.
You can at least say, like he's an amateur, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like I say, here's an archaeologist making the argument.
Yeah.
And I dug through, and I actually used Salem's book on Nazareth to actually prove to myself, yes, there was a Bethlehem, because I found a paper. It said, here are these kinds of bits of pottery from the Herodian period. I looked at that. And because the same drawings are in Salem's book, I was like, yep, these are Herodian. I'm done. There's clearly a Bethlehem. It was a tiny town, but it definitely did exist. So anyone who tells you that was also an invented town, unfortunately, that is not a good skeptical argument.
Yeah, and I can't say I've actually come across that. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for the comments there, guys. And I'm enjoying this. Alan Bird, I appreciate the super chat, my brother. In the Proto-Evangelium of James, Evangelium, however you want to pronounce it, of James, Mary's hymen remains intact. Proof the birth narrative continued to develop. Do the guests know of other inventions?
I'll leave that to you, Aaron.
Well, yeah, there's like a half dozen different gospels that come afterwards to fill in all sorts of details. For example, somewhat recently published, there's a gospel that's called the Revelation of the Magi that basically gives the backstory to the Magi and what they were expecting and what they saw. And basically, there wasn't just miracle stuff happening in Jerusalem or in Bethlehem, but all the way in their home country, that like statues were moving, and the star first came to them at the top of a cave in a mountain. Tons and tons of extra details just with that. That we see the stories of Mary get developed in the Proto-Gospel of James, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, where we get a little bit more of him as a child. The Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. This one's actually a bit interesting because this one is not just a fake gospel, but it even faked his credentials. It came with a cover letter allegedly from St. Jerome, authenticating this is a translation of from Jerome from the original Hebrew of Matthew. So even his credentials are faked. It's amazing that way.
Wow.
But it includes, among the stories, adding to it, Jesus taming dragons as a child.
That's believable, actually.
But this is hugely important. I mean, I think the importance of this question is that even Christians admit, by point of fact that they're non-canonical, that there are overtly mythological tales made up by Christian communities. You've got to remember, these aren't like random people just going, I'm going to write just some crazy story about Jesus. These are reflective in some way of what people believed in some communities somewhere at a point in time, right? So they are written. They're just really interesting because they show the process of mythologization of Jesus and his life and the stories about him. Now, okay, so some Christian powers that be have gone, right, these are acceptable, these aren't acceptable. But I'd say that's an arbitrary line. And in fact, I would argue that that's taking place within the canonical Gospels as well. And I think there's special pleading that goes on to differentiate between the two. And I think they do tell us a lot about the nature of the development of Jesus and the Jesus story.
I agree. And they really believe this. I mean, there were real groups that believed this stuff. That's what really gets me. There were no canonical text early on.
Yes,
that's
of course.
another really important point.
And we forget that because we retroject, we look back and say, this is the Bible, we know it. And so that's what everyone knew it as. And when you talk about the first 200, 300 years, you're like, yes, there was this Bible that everyone had. We were like, no, at the time of writing, of Matthew writing his gospel, he only had Mark. And that's arguable, you know, how much of Mark or what kind of Mark he had is another debate, and whether he had Q. But like, he didn't have John and he didn't have Luke. And so the whole idea of who Jesus was entirely different to what we have now. But we just think everyone had the same idea of Jesus because we've got the Bible and therefore everyone had the Bible. And I know like academics don't think like that, but the general sort of idea is we kind of project ourselves onto early Christians, I think.
Super chat from Satan. This is an interesting name. Satan. 666 is how much he super chatted as well. He said Jehovah's Witness, or she, I don't know who it is. I just see there I go with my patriarchal upbringing. Jehovah's Witnesses believe the star was a sign from Satan because it led astrologers to Herod first. Have you heard of that? I've never heard of that.
Yeah, this gets onto a really philosophical problem to do with the Star of Bethlehem that I think is one of the most powerful arguments against Matthew's story.
I do think it's funny, though, that Rabbi Tovia Singer, I had him on one time just, you know, I always have him on to poke into the New Testament because he sees things that most aren't paying attention to. But he's like, come on, guys. His point, and this is his point, you might disagree. He thinks Matthew is being anti-Semitic. And the reason is he's saying, why would you have, when you have a GPS star that's going to take you directly to the house where the Messiah's at, stop at King of the Jews, Herod, right there where Aaron's pointing.
It's very hard to do this.
Yeah, like why would you have him go there first? And this was his point, and I'll shut up. He makes the point that you would have him go there to show how vile the leader of the Jews really was, even ready to kill a Messiah of his own people. This is his point of making it, which is trying to pitch it to the Gentiles. And then he doesn't know where it's at. They don't know where's the Messiah at, but you just had a star directing you. So this is his point. But
I would disagree because I think that I wouldn't see it as so overtly anti-Semitic. I would see it as actually replaying the Moses story, that he needs Herod to be the new Pharaoh, and it's the only way he can get the killing of the firstborn so that Jesus can be chased into Egypt, and then out of Egypt I will call my son Israel. So I think this is all part of a theological story where Jesus is just a retelling of Moses. I wouldn't personally, I wouldn't call it an anti-Semitic project, but it obviously, you know, Herod's not painted in good light, but then he was a pretty bad dude. So, you know,
I'll be kind of the halfway house between the two, because I also see Matthew involving the chiefs, the scribes in this as well, that they're basically all complicit together, and they all failed to see the sign of the Messiah. And of course, later on in the story, they become Jesus's enemies. So though I wouldn't say that's necessarily anti-Semitic, it was definitely against the Jewish elite, the Jewish top dogs, not necessarily against anyone who's circumcised. Also to the super chat, I think we should add one other thing as well, that there's also one other individual I want to bring up who also in a story says the Star of Bethlehem was Satan. Agatha Christie, famous for all of her detective novels. She also had this short story of an angel visiting Mary, telling her, here's all the things going to happen, but something terrible is going to happen to your wonderful son. So if you give him to me, we can help prevent him from, like, you know, being put up on a cross and all those terrible things. But Mary somehow sees through it, and it was actually Satan in disguise the whole time. And when Satan shot off, because remember, Satan is also the morning star, that was the star that was seen by the wise men. And so Satan accidentally signaled the coming of the Messiah. It's a clever little story where you now have two groups of people saying the star was Satan.
Interesting. I mean,
I wonder if we can quickly if we can have a little analysis of Herod and Quirinius, like a little chat about that, and then that would lay up, I think, Aaron's can regale us with huge amounts of interesting stuff about the Star of Bethlehem. Does that make sense? If we talk about the 10-year problem, and then here's one half of that problem, the Star of Bethlehem and Herod. Does that make sense?
So long as we can do it in less than 10 years.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, we can do it.
One of the most fundamental issues between the two stories is that you have in Luke's. We talked about the method of getting Jesus born in Bethlehem. Luke's method is having a census by Quirinius, whereby Joseph, for some reason, has to go for the census from Galilee, which is in a completely different taxation area, down to Bethlehem to register for the census, so that Jesus can be born. And this happens under Quirinius, and we know that census happened in 6 CE. We know that for a whole bunch of reasons. We know, I'll go on to that in a second. Matthew has Jesus being born in Bethlehem, already living there, and Herod being alive, because the Magi come across from the east, get involved in the story, and then come down, and Herod slaughters the innocents. So if you are going to marry these two stories together, Luke's tax census under Quirinius has to coexist with Herod being king of the Jews. Now, the problem is, we know the census happened in 6 CE, and we know that Herod died in 4 or 5 BCE. And we know both of these things really rather well. Like these are, but what happens is the apologist recognizes that this is a problem. Like the received history is this. And they either try and move Herod's death, or Herod's death further forward so that it coincides with the 6 CE Quirinius census, or they try and move the census of Quirinius backwards to coincide with the life of Herod. And so therefore, this 10-year gap represents, I think, the most fundamental issue between the two stories. Aaron, you part of how we know that Herod died in 4 BCE or 5 BCE is to do with Josephus, and one of the benchmark moments of Herod's life before he dies is a lunar eclipse. How does this help us date Herod's reign and death?
All right. So first off, there's actually even a multiplicity of things where, fortunately, even beyond just one astronomical alignment. So first off, Josephus is very clear that Herod began his reign in a particular year. He says it was in the year with these people as the consuls. It was in this Olympian year. And then he also says, and this is the year he truly took control of Jerusalem. So he's pinpointing the exact year he starts.
37 BC.
Correct. And then he says, and Herod then ruled for 37 years from when he was declared king by the Senate of Rome, 34 years. Yes. Yeah, and 34 years by when he was, in fact, actually running the show, when he finally took control. So basically, you can just say, do the math, you're already going to be in the right neighborhood. It gets a little bit confusing because Josephus, as well as the Old Testament and many other sources, then use inclusive dating. So basically, if the date is a little bit more than a year, or it includes a month in 1 year, then it counts as a full year. So this adds a little bit of buffer to those numbers. So what helps us pinpoint it a bit more is that, according to Josephus, basically in the last days, Herod is being very Herod. He is being very paranoid. He's attacking people. He's I think he was burning one of the priests alive. And when this was going on, after this incident of a group of really zealous Jews tearing down one of the eagles on the front door to the temple because it was considered a sacrilegious object, Herod goes nuts, kills people, and then shortly after, there was a lunar eclipse. And because we're good astronomers today, we know when eclipses happen. We know when and where they were visible. We have this to such level of precision. There's no doubt about when and where solar and lunar eclipses were in our history. So there's a few different eclipses people will point to. The one that is most commonly used is that in January of 4 BC, there was a partial lunar eclipse. And if Herod then dies shortly after that, then this takes place just before the next Passover that Josephus mentions. And so that is as far as we can possibly go. A lunar eclipse in early 4 BC, the following Passover, all of his will is supposed to have been read out and figured out, and everyone is supposed to know who's actually running his kingdom. The other possibility is in late 5 BC, there was also a total lunar eclipse. And just so everyone knows their astronomy, a total lunar eclipse is basically where the moon even more completely goes into the shadow of the earth and really becomes deeply blood red. And it's usually the more spectacular view. And this, because some people will argue that there wasn't enough time between the 4 BC eclipse and the Passover for all the events that Josephus mentions happening in that short period of time. Others disagree. But I would say, well, if we just take the one in late 5 BC, that one probably fits, all the time just fine because it adds several more months. And let's see, there's in particular a Bible scholar by the name of Timothy Barnes wrote an article about this a few decades ago and also brings up a couple other points and sources that, to me convinces me late 5 BCE is probably the best guess for when Herod died, but 4 BCE cannot be excluded. Those who want to go beyond that basically have to really not care what Josephus says and make him say anything else to get the system to work.
So technically, it would be further apart than closer if we're going to go with the real, like full-blown eclipse instead of the partial.
So what Aaron is saying is the terminus ad quem, which is what we call the latest date it possibly can be, is 4 to 3 BC at a stretch, depending on how but 4 BC, but realistically it's likely to be 5 BC. Would that be correct?
Yeah, late 5, early 4, that's our best guesstimate. And pushing it to 3 or 2, or some people will try pushing it all the way to 1 AD. I've seen some people try to make that argument. But again, Josephus is clear. Herod starts this year. He rules this many years. Do the math. You can't add an extra 5 years or 10 years to that willy-nilly.
I got to admit, though, this super chat, it's coming through at the right time. And GJC Services, thank you for your super chat. Help the support of the channel, all of that. Thank you. He says, what did Mary and Joe do with the cash prizes the wise guys brought? The $1 million question,
Oh, I know exactly what happened. It's actually quite obvious. They're in Egypt, so they went to the Luxor casino.
Dude.
Nice.
Why didn't we know this already? I'm glad we brought you on today, Aaron. We'd be lost without you being the shining star of the show, being able to direct us in the right path. Yeah, I seriously appreciate the super chat, though. But
that's an interesting question because actually, genuinely, that sounds like a silly, facetious question. But actually, it's an interesting question because genuinely, if they were genuinely given that stuff, right, there's every chance that they should be rich. And in fact, Paul talks about Jesus being rich, but everyone, the inference everywhere else is that, or the implications are that Jesus is poor, right, or Jesus' family is poor. And so, given that, given he was given these amazing things, and this is the thing, and the shepherds knew, the wise men knew, apparently all of Jerusalem knew, or like the soldiers and the scribes, you've got this weird scenario whereby Jesus should be super famous, right? And then he goes back to Nazareth. Like everyone should be like, "This is where have you been? Well, we've been for 2 years in Egypt, but check out this gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Oh, and by the way, Jesus, that baby I was pregnant with, like he's a Messiah. Like, and so but that what we'd expect if this truly happened, right, is not what we get from the Gospels, which makes us. It just all leads towards this idea that the infancy narratives are just tacked on, and in fact, there's arguments to show that the infancy narratives in Luke 1 and 2 were interpolations, and in fact, when you look at Luke 3, it starts with these very obvious quotes that shows it's kind of like the start of the gospel, and then it has a genealogy, and you're like, okay, so Luke 3 is where Luke really starts, which means the 1 and 2 are tacked on later. Now, the great Catholic exegete, Raymond Brown, The Birth of the Messiah, if you're ever going to get a book other than mine and Aaron's, get that. It's just a phenomenal book. But like he says that Luke himself interpolated it. He later added it. It was added later, but it was Luke. A lot of other scholars say, no, it was the Greek is different and so on and so forth. It looks like Luke 1 and 2 is just tacked on later by someone else. Then what's the reason? Why did that? It's really interesting, but certainly what we see in the Gospels is nothing that we'd expect if this stuff actually happened. Sorry.
I agree. No, thank you. And another super chat by Flip. Thank you, Flip, for the super chat, the support. Any particular reason Mary was chosen? If humans are born with sin, but she was born without sin, wouldn't that mean an infinitely large family tree of sinless people to make her happen? I think this is why this problem of let's make her born sinless somehow and having this doctrine created by the Catholics.
Yeah,
Aaron?
because in the Proto-Evangelium, she's basically born the same sort of way John the Baptist is. Old parents who weren't able to have kids, and all of a sudden, a little bit of God juice coming in and makes things happen. And then she's supposed to be born and raised in the temple for like 12 years until she's ready to be given off to Joseph. I mean, she's basically like prepared from birth to be the vessel. That's like the theology that's being set up in the infancy gospel of James. And beyond that, well, I guess if you also want to have like as generic a name as possible in the Hebrew world, Mary's it.
The God juice. Always remember the God juice. Nah.
So with regards to Herod and benchmarking Herod's life, it's not just Josephus. Although it's interesting to think that if you start picking apart Josephus here, it's like this dominoes or house of cards just falls down. So it's really difficult to say Josephus got it wrong here, because he got it wrong here, everything shifts, and Josephus's entire history is suddenly out by 10 years, and so you can't just say Josephus got that date wrong. Like, it just, that is not that easy. But then we know who the governors were in Judea at the time. We know that Quintilius Varus was in charge. The coinage for him stops in 4 BCE, and in fact we're pretty sure he finished ruling then. So why that's important is because if he's ruling for the last years of Herod's life, then there is no space for Quirinius to be ruling as the governor who gives a census. Now, what's also super important here is that Herod died, and at the time Judea was a client kingdom. What this means is a client kingdom is a buffer zone at the edge of the Roman Empire, whereby the rulers have a degree of autonomy. The Romans is not a full Roman province, so Romans couldn't tax directly client kingdoms. What they're demanded is a tribute paid by client kingdoms, and they'd had to raise them themselves. So you could imagine Herod could create a tax himself. Well, he would have been taxing himself. He could have had a census himself, but there's no evidence that he did. And anyway, the census Luke claims is from Quirinius. But what happened is Herod died, and he had 2 sons, Herod Archelaus and Herod Antipas, and they took over these tetrarchies of these certain areas. And Herod Archelaus ruled Judea for 10 years. And we know this for different sort of sources. And then after the 10 years, so that fits in with the 4 BCE, because we know that Quirinius's census happened in 6 CE. And what happened is Herod Archelaus ruled for 10 years, did a pretty poor job. And the Romans said, we are going to take back control of this client kingdom. And it's now going to become a full-blown Roman province. Now, being a full-blown Roman province and being Romans, we need to know how much money we can get out of it. So we need to hold a census that will allow us to calculate how much this place is worth and how much each area of this place is worth. And this census will be for taxation purposes. And that will be Quirinius doing that in 6 CE. So when you work out Herod died in 4 BCE, you've got a 10-year gap of Herod Archelaus ruling. And then you've got the client kingdom becoming a Roman province and Quirinius taking over and holding a census. All of this makes sense, right? This is totally coherent. What you cannot have is Quirinius having that census at the time of Herod the Great, all the way back here. You cannot have that. And as Kip Davis said in there, well, how do Christians deal with this? Well, they, as we said earlier, they try and move things. They try and have Quirinius having a double rulership. They try and have a 2 census scenario. They try and have all these things. None of them work.
Wow.
That's basically a synopsis of the problem.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, there's always an exit. You always can find one, no matter what. That's what we did. Is there anything we're missing here? Because I'd love to ask, before we do go, Jonathan, I'd like to get Aaron to tell us about this book a little bit, because in particular, we're going to go through this book, but I want to interview you specifically on this. Can you tease us with this one in particular, Aaron?
Yes. So this has been a project that started back when I was still in college, when I first learned about these sorts of hypotheses, and then found out that because in particular, I was working at a planetarium at the university I was at. I then went home and then found out people were saying other things than what we did at our planetarium. And I realized, okay, nobody agrees on what this is. I dig into it. I also find out, actually, even most of the people who run the planetariums that give the shows that try to explain the Star of Bethlehem totally scientifically don't believe it themselves. So what is going on here that, we're perpetuating this, and most people think it's either bogus or just not very good. People that have been arguing about this, as I then learned, for basically about 200 years. And I had to figure out what's going on here, dig into this, and find out, so what are the scientific explanations out there? How well do they stack up? Is it actually enough to rescue the historicity of any part of the gospel, or is it one more part that just pretty much absolutely proves that Matthew was going out of his way to make an incredible story, not a credible one?
I love the way you said that. Incredible, not credible. Well put, well put. Well, I hope everybody goes down in the description for Christmas. Bless your Christian friends with this. Amen. Hallelujah. I got to speak in tongues here because I'm feeling it. Jonathan, you've got something on your mind. I could tell. What is it?
No, I was just looking at the. I was just waiting for Aaron to go. So this is the perfect. So what we're saying is that Herod and the census can't happen at the same time. And before, I don't know that we're going to get a chance to talk about all the massive problems with the census, but let's concentrate on Herod for a little bit and bring Aaron's knowledge of the Star of Bethlehem, which is fascinating because there's all sorts of trawling both the Old Testament for Balaam and Balak and Daniel and all these ideas that are imbued in the Star of Bethlehem. But we get this narrative that is just absolutely bonkers, especially if it's never evidenced at all anywhere else, either in or outside the Bible. And it's just that argument from silence is a really valid one. So, Aaron, do you want to talk us through the story of Matthew's Star of Bethlehem?
Yes. So to fully appreciate what's happening here, first, just on the political stage, we have actually three political powers all going at once in this. We have Herod, most obviously, the king of Judea. But how does he even have any control at all? Because he is backed by the Romans. He basically was in control because he first was personally friendly with Mark Antony, and then later became buddies with Octavius, later Caesar Augustus. And the only reason his family even got involved was that his father basically came to Julius Caesar's rescue at one point. So basically the whole reason the Herods have any control is because the Romans are there to enforce it. And conversely, the reason Herod was able to take control is because of who he had to fight against, the Persian or Parthian Empire. And this is important because the wise men, or the Magi, are said to come from the east. And in particular, the word Magi, magos, this word is actually used to describe a priest from the Zoroastrian faith, the main religion for the Persians. These guys were also not just like your neighborhood rabbi with like no political clout. No, they were actually literally part of the government. They were basically a part of the equivalent of the Persian Senate. They actually got to choose, in part, who was the king of the Persians. They were literal kingmakers. So having them come from Persia to Israel, a Roman-controlled territory, is involving three major political forces, two of them literal superpowers. That's just the setup.
So this is political propaganda as well as theological.
At the very least, if it was supposed to have happened, it should have been quite the historical move, because you literally have Persians coming in saying to Herod, someone else is ruling this place now. We say so. And it's because literally the heavens have told us that this is the case.
Yeah, the star right there above his head.
Yes. that this was supposed to be first indicating to them that the King of the Jews is born, and then eventually leading them to the exact domicile in Bethlehem, so that way they can give expensive gifts to the person that they prostrate themselves to, and using like a word that you would use to basically say, holy cow, you be holy, we're kowtowing to you. That's like this description of how much these Zoroastrian priests, Zoroastrians, coming to worship a Jewish king. If that's not setting off some alarm bells, then maybe I need to say that again. This is already an extremely weird circumstance with political overtones. And then, of course, they're apparently also stupid because they have to be told not to go back to Herod. It's that somehow they think Herod isn't, interested in taking care of this kid. Remember, this Herod, first off, fought the Persians to actually gain control. Towards the end of his life, he also thought the Persians were involved in a plot to try to poison him. In this plot as well, he ended up executing his own children along the way. Herod became so well known for killing his own children and his own wife that Caesar Augustus had this pun that works well in Greek that basically said, I'd rather be Herod's pig than Herod's son.
Yeah.
Because how murderous he is. And yet somehow the Magi don't seem to have any thought that, maybe the person we just told isn't king anymore is going to be totally okay with being usurped. I guess there's no issue there. Herod, on the other hand, completely trusting the group of people who he thinks were just a few years ago trying to assassinate him. And he just lets them go on their merry way, doesn't either stop them dead in their tracks, and I mean dead in their tracks, or at least follow them with spies to eliminate the problem child, right from the get-go, instead completely trusting the group. And again, Herod, perhaps one of the most paranoid people in in Jewish history of this time. So it makes no sense. And I haven't even talked about, oh, by the way, magic star.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, Aaron, is it worth also like pointing out the audience that Matthew had in mind? So who was Matthew writing for? Yeah,
well, his audience ultimately is going to be at least Greek speaking because that's the language he writes in. So he's really writing this basically to the Greco-Roman audience. And this also shows because of an interesting mistake he makes that actually relates to the super chat that just popped up about the Magi being astrologers. We know something about Zoroastrian priests at this time. They were not astrologers. In fact, our texts tell us that they thought the planets were evil, that they were basically controlled by the Zoroastrian version of Satan. If they saw a moving star, they would not have said, oh, let's follow that. They would have said, demon star, bad news. This is not what we're expecting. Now, why is Matthew, though, saying that these guys are following a star? Because in the Greco-Roman world, there was this mistaken belief that Zoroaster, so originally the prophet is named Zarathustra, but in Greek it becomes Zoroaster. Aster, that root name or part of his name looks like the word star. So they thought, okay, he does star stuff. Literally that sort of etymology created an entire body of Greek literature saying that Zarathustra started astrology and taught it to the world. It's completely historically false, but it's a stereotype that Matthew seems to believe, which again is a big hint that he only knows Greco-Roman stereotypes, not real history. Whoops.
Very interesting. We got a super chat from Charles Wilcox. Magi were a line of astrologers originally taught by Daniel, Yahweh fearers. Eastern tradition. Happy Festivus. Thank you so much for the super chat, my friend. Are you in agreement here in particular on this?
With the winky face, yes. It is worth noting that in the Septuagint, or at least I should say the Greek translation of the Old Testament, because there's actually a couple different versions of Daniel that were in Greek that were used at the time. But this is actually the only translation of the Old Testament where the Greek word magoi or magus actually shows up, which is a bit interesting. Now, there's also a historical problem with the way it's used there, because the Magi, they are a part of the Zoroastrian priesthood, they are part of the Persians, and yet in Daniel, they are part of the court to Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king. In other words, they're there too early. So guess what? My research also shows Daniel's also fake. It all comes together. It's just a big pile of fake on top of fake on top of fiction. It becomes interesting when you see it that way, when you see that basically it's like fan fiction of Harry Potter. It's not historical recollection.
Wow. Well put. Thank you so much for that super chat, and Aaron for answering.
The reason I was talking about the audience, because there is the element that there is a notion that Matthew is appealing more to a Jewish audience. I know he's writing in Greek, but more to a Jewish audience than, say, Luke is. So Luke is arguably, aiming his story at Gentiles. And so therefore, the idea that he's using these Zoroastrians from Persia to kneel down to Jesus is a way of politically saying, look, we're trumping the Persians here, that our religion is more important than we've got even these people who Judaism, the Jewish context within which this whole everything's being set here, have historically had this kind of issue with primacy with the Persians, and look, they've gone and knelt down to Jesus. So this is a kind of a win-win. But also, Aaron, what's your idea about how the and I haven't done my reading up on this, so this is like 10 years since I wrote this book, but the Magi are a rewriting of the Balaam Balak sort of Old Testament story.
Yeah. So there's a few things that people will point to. So first off, so the audience knows that we're referring specifically to a collection of prophecies from the book of Numbers, from the Old Testament. And in there we have a priest or wizard, whichever word we might want to use, because different words are used for him, by the name of Balaam. He is trying to actually curse the Jews, but God is basically controlling his mouth. So instead of every time he's trying to curse them, he's actually blessing them and prophesying. The most famous of these is what's called the star prophecy. He says he sees a star coming out of Jacob and a scepter out of Israel, and then will come along and smash the heads of Moab, and basically kick butt, take names, as we might put in modern parlance. So in other traditions, for example, I believe it's actually mentioned by Philo of Alexandria that he actually uses the word magas to describe the sorts of activities that Balaam was supposed to be doing. So
I think was he the first magas? Was he basically the first Magi?
Some people even like in other traditions, at least later Christian traditions, will even say that Balaam started the Magi, he started astrology, basically trying to make everything foundational back to this one particular person. So that way Jesus can be, again, fulfilling prophecy as he's supposed to do with every time he takes a breath.
So, I mean, the similarities, I listed them in my book. Again, I wasn't prepared for this, but so excuse me if I misremember certain things. But Balaam and the Magi both came from the East. Balaam and the Magi were all Magi. In fact, it is often claimed that Balaam was the founder of the Magi tradition. The Magi were probably three, and Balaam also came out of the East as three, with two servants. Balaam foiled Balak by revealing oracles predicting the greatness of Israel and its royal ruler. The Magi foiled Herod, also revealing a great ruler over all of Israel. Herod and Balak are comparable kings. These despotic kings used foreign Magi to rid themselves of an enemy, but the Magi end up honoring the enemies. The Pharaoh and his scribes conspire against Moses upon hearing of the birth of Herod, and his scribes conspire against Jesus upon hearing of his birth. So this is all the kind of like the layers of it, of symbolism that's going on here, and intertextuality between the Old and New Testament. Dreams and visions are used in both stories. The prophecy of Balaam supposedly directly foretelling the Messiah, which was understood as such in pre-Jesus times, such as with the Qumran community. And after the main events of the story, Balaam, quote, Balaam went off to his home, Numbers 24:25, and the Magi went away to their own country, Matthew 2:12. So the point being is that it appears that Matthew, with his attempt to appeal to a Jewish audience, is retelling this famous Magi story through the Magi again. And then there's Daniel references as well and all sorts. So yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Flip Flopsky, thank you so much for the super chat. Appreciate the support, my friend. The place they are calling Bethlehem was there in the 1st century. They just don't know if it was called Bethlehem at that time, is my understanding of that problem. Do they?
So I'm trying to think where he might be going with that, or where that idea might be coming from. So Bethlehem is actually, the oldest reference we have to it is actually in the Amarna letters from Egypt. So like over 1,000 years before our time with JC here. Though I believe in those letters, of course, they don't call it by the Hebrew name. I think they say something more like along the lines of Bet Lamu, which is like house of some other different god name. And then it slowly evolved to the form that we see in Hebrew, Bethlehem, which literally would mean like house of bread. So that might be what he's going at. By the time of the Bible, we certainly have it being known as Bethlehem. After all, the whole point is that it was supposed to be the town of David, and it's clearly called Bethlehem in the Old Testament. So I'm not sure where else he might be coming from on that.
Thank you so much, Flip. I appreciate the super chat. I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, so I do appreciate that support, man. Thank you. So what do we do with the census? Is there a way to touch it and not like?
Well, I think there's a lot more to be said on the Magi here that is massively important. So, like I said earlier, the Magi appear to be a literary mechanism to get Herod involved, and to also show that the Zoroastrians are kneeling down to the Messiah Jesus. So it's like Jesus is more important than Zoroastrian. We win that religious battle. So you get the Magi coming out of the east. They are following this star, and Aaron can talk about whether this star, is a supernatural star or not. But it seems very clear to me that this is a supernatural star because they're following it, and you can't follow a normal star. So they're following this star. They then sort of seem to lose it in Jerusalem, which is interesting, right? But the only reason this can happen is if Matthew wants them to pick up Herod. So they go around saying, well, where's this new king that's to be born? And everyone goes a bit, like they look through the scribes, find out that or remind themselves that the Messiah is supposed to be born in Bethlehem. And then Herod goes, oh my goodness, right. So, but instead of like Herod being the person he is, would surely say, right, we're taking you hostage and we're all going down to wherever this place is, or I'm going to accompany you. We're all going to be very nice about this, but you're going to be accompanied by some armed guards. And when you get there, we're going to say, we'll kneel down as well, but actually we'll kill him. But he doesn't say this. He says, brilliant. Okay, well, I'm going to trust you. You're going to come back and tell me where this new Messiah is born, and we'll go down and worship him as well. So that's all a bit weird. And anyway, the Magi pick up the star again, then go down to Bethlehem, and it indicates a single house. And then they go into the house and they worship Jesus. Now, here's the massive problem, as if that all wasn't nonsense enough. They have a dream sequence whereby they are warned not to go back to Herod. And so they then go back home a different route. Now, the problem here is that Herod, because they don't return and they don't tell him exactly where the child is, Herod goes down and kills a bunch of children. It doesn't really matter whether it's one children or 100,000 children, right? Herod kills a bunch of innocent kids because the Magi go back the other way. We have God intervening to warn the Magi so that something happens that he deems shouldn't happen.
Can I put it another way? We have God intervening to save men and women, or to save mankind, okay? And instead of having the Magi somehow, find a way to where he could keep Herod from killing all these other children, which God is trying to save, it makes no sense the way I'm already. You see what I'm doing here?
So the dream sequence, this is the huge problem of the story that I think is terminal, right? Because I think it means God is desiring that a certain and Jesus is responsible for the death of innocents, right? So that dream sequence could have happened before they got to Jerusalem. So God is sovereign and powerful over everything. So why did God not have the dream sequence before they get to Jerusalem to say, don't go to Jerusalem because Herod's an evil guy and he's going to try and kill everyone.
Yeah.
You want to go down to Bethlehem because that's where he's born, or due to be born, or is born, or whatever. So that dream sequence would have diverted them down to Bethlehem. Herod would have known nothing and would have not come down and murdered a bunch of children. But instead, they go to Jerusalem, lose the star, get Herod involved, and then they have the warning. And so they go back a different way. And Herod then comes down and kills innocent children. This is a philosophical quagmire for Christians, because there is no way around the fact that God could have had it another way, but didn't. And therefore, it seems like God is designing innocent children to die on account of warning the Magi about Herod.
Mm.
And
but
even
his ways
worse
are
than
above
that,
our ways.
Yeah. Well, and even worse than that is that it's not an incidental thing that these children die. That it's not that God failed to go out of his way to try to protect them, because their slaughter was also prophetic. In other words, God planned on these children to be killed. So this is truly monstrous when you're, centuries in advance and say, okay, I want to get the message across that I'm important. What's going to do it? Prophesying and making true dead babies. That is the plan. That is some vile, vile theism right there.
Yeah, because we have this parallelism between the Herod's slaughter of the innocents and Pharaoh's,
right,
or the death of the firstborn in the last plague of the Exodus story. And so, Matthew is doing something very intentional here. He's like, Jesus is a new Moses. I want Jesus to be like the super Jew. And so therefore he has to trump Moses. So he has to do what Moses does, but in a bigger and better way. And this is one of those techniques that Matthew uses, but he needs there to be a new Pharaoh, and Herod is the perfect person to do this. So he uses literary mechanisms to get him involved. But that kind of parallelism means that he needs innocent children to die.
Yeah, Frank Jones in the chat, my friend, you're not seeing it. You're just not. I'm just going to be nice and say that. You're not seeing it, dude. And trust me, I didn't see it 9-10 years ago either. I made excuses. In fact, there was nothing wrong with what God did. God can do what he wants. He's the potter and you're the clay. So you justifying saying this is wrong and he could have done dreams beforehand, that's all God's plan. And you know what? You can blame him all you want, but you know what? You have no right to. And it's like, yeah, I get it. It's a whole different pair of glasses that you put on. You ever put on someone's glasses who had like 100, 200 vision and they're farsighted and you're nearsighted and you literally are blind? That's what it's like putting on the Christian glasses now versus what it was when I wore them, and hearing what you would have said, I'd have justified it. Yeah. No, that's part of the sorry, you were born and God saw you as dung. Your righteousness was filthy rags. You are trash without Jesus in your heart. And that's why he's going to throw you in a pile of fire forever and ever. That's the crap that we believed. So,
I wonder, Aaron, given the supernatural nature of this star, which I think is what's clearly, clearly what Matthew is communicating here. Now, given the astrological and astronomical acumen of people at this time, do you think it's realistic that 3 people alone would notice his star? 3 people alone, or not even 3, we don't know how many Magi there were, but the Magi alone would notice his star, then decide to follow this star. Well, you've already said that's problematic given they're Zoroastrians, they wouldn't do that. Then it would take them to Jerusalem and then to a single house that no one else would report this at all. I mean, what's going on there?
Yeah. So in the various attempts to try to explain the star astronomically, there is then the issue, well, if it was something big and obvious in the sky, shouldn't there be some other record of it? So, for example, those who want to propose that it was actually a comet, then, yeah, you're right. Everyone pretty much in the world would have noticed this big old comet in the sky. Now, to be fair, there are comets recorded around the time of Jesus, and they're recorded in Chinese annals. But it still does begs the question that if this thing was so obviously indicating the birth of a Jewish king, then, yeah, why is it only 3 guys from Ctesiphon or Babylon, wherever they might be coming from, And yeah, why is no one from the rest of Jerusalem noticing, who might also be looking for a king? We know, for example, the people who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls were interested in astrology. We have their records, so we can tell they were casting horoscopes. They were doing astrological medicine. So you'd think they could also notice and say, hey, there's something astronomically or astrologically interesting. Hey, we're interested in Judaism. Let's check this out. Why is it, the folks over in another nation who don't even practice that sort of astrology that was really popular in the Greco-Roman world, especially with the Caesars coming to power. That's really when like astrology really started taking off in the political court. Like Tiberius in particular was like neck deep into astrology. He was really into it. Caesar Augustus, he apparently visited astrologers and then started printing like his birth sign, Capricorn, on his coins and things like that. And again, nobody from Rome seemed to notice this apparently astrologically interesting thing. It was just, we say 3 dudes, but of course we don't even know the number. The gospel just gives us the plural, and that could be anywhere from 2 to 200,000 or whatever else.
Interesting. Yeah, well put. Well put.
And of course, there's no evidence at all that the slaughter of the innocents took place. Now, some Christian apologists would say, well, actually, the slaughter of the innocents may have just been a dozen children, maybe 6 children, maybe 50. No one knows the number. But the point is, yes, okay, this is the sort of thing that Herod might have done. He was a pretty horrible person, and we can imagine him doing something like this. But he was also a pretty well-documented person. Josephus has an awful lot of information on Herod, and there is absolutely no attestation to this happening at all anywhere. And so it's bizarre that, nowhere does Herod say, nowhere is there any evidence Herod believes that there's an upstart king, like a messiah figure, trying to take over. Yes, he kills his children and does all sorts of horrible things, but there's none of this whole narrative exists in any of the known history of Herod.
I know a guy actually who's writing a book. He's not a big grammar guy, but he's saying he needs to have it edited grammatically, who thought that Jesus was a family member of Herod. And of course, this is a stretch, but the point is, he's taking what we're talking about as fiction, and then the historical reliability of this guy being a bad guy, killing off his actual own family, and that he's trying to match them and say, well, he was trying to kill off his own descendants who would have been one of his family members, which would have been Jesus, and that Jesus was actually the real Messiah that was supposed to take his father's place, right? This is the kind of idea he had. And I thought to myself, I'd be interested in reading it. He never sent it to me yet. He was writing a book about this, but it just goes to show you how far someone can go in trying to make historical something that's theological based on the fact that this guy was a horrible individual.
Well, that's what the gospel writers did. So, yeah.
Exactly.
I wonder, Aaron, how much do you know about this? So Matthew is writing sometime in the 80s, probably. When did you say he was writing, Aaron?
Well, in my book, I basically just say, I don't know. And I just basically give like the absolute limits on when he could have written. So he seems to clearly know about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So he has to be writing after that. He is clearly quoted in Justin Martyr, so around 150. And I basically say, that's about the best limits I'm willing to put in. And anywhere in that time frame I can work with. So the traditional thing of calling in the 80s, sure. But I would like to be more dogmatically uncertain on when the gospel was written, because I haven't really found any good arguments convincingly that can actually shorten that time frame. And why to put in a particular decade versus another has not been convincing to me. And just on top of that, the arguments that have been pushing like the Gospel of Luke well into the 2nd century, it seems like there's nothing really forcing Matthew to then stay in the 1st century to me. There's no necessity at this point.
The reason I asked that is because he's clearly writing after 66 CE. Right.
Yes.
And there's an interesting observation made in the Journal of the British Astronomy Association by a chap called Jenkins all the way back in 2004.
Yes.
And this is a really good, I find this really interesting. I'd like to know your thoughts on it. He says, in addition, during these times, it is a historical fact that a deputation of Magi did come from the east to bring gifts and pay homage, and they did return home by another route. Also, a bright comet with an impressive tail appeared over Jerusalem. In AD 66, Tiridates, the king of Armenia, led a notable procession of Magi to pay homage to Nero. After Nero had confirmed Tiridates as the king of Armenia, the king, quote, the king did not return by the route he had followed in coming, close quote, but sailed back to Armenia by a different route. He came through Illyricum and north of the Ionian Sea and returned by sailing from Brundisium to Dyrrachium. So the point being that there were Magi that came to the east to following a comet, or not following a comet, but heralded by a comet, or perhaps because of a comet, to pay a homage to the Emperor Nero, and then went back a different route. Could Matthew be using this as a template for Jesus?
Possibly, but I don't find that convincing for a few reasons. One is that none of the historians who describe the trip of Tiridates with his enclave of Magi connect it with the comet that came in that year as well. And by the way, this was Halley's comet in 66 AD. So like the events don't seem to be connected by any historical record. And also I find it a little bit hard to believe that the event was so well remembered that people remembered that they came back to Armenia by a different route. And this is was important enough for Matthew to mention. So that sort of detail kind of, puts it off for me. And also the fact that if Matthew is trying to emulate this story, is he trying to make Jesus look like Nero? Of all the emperors, that's a bad choice.
Is this in Josephus that you just read from?
I believe it comes the most from Cassius Dio.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know. This sounds like a common trope almost. Like there's something, obviously there's a star or a comet. There is an omen at that point.
Yeah, usually bad.
Yeah, usually bad. And Nero seems to be that kind of guy. So I wonder if this is literary as well on Nero. So makes me kind of wonder. I don't know.
As I mentioned, if you want to be copying from an emperor, we have a much better choice, I think. And that is with the stories of Julius Caesar, the comet scene after his death, and then how that transformed the story of the Aeneid, basically the founding myth for Rome, where Aeneas and his family and his fellow Trojans are, destitute because they've now completely lost the Trojan War. They're asking for divine assistance, and lo and behold, a star appears in the sky, shoots across, and basically provides them their direction to their new homeland in the West to found, Rome. And that would also, be pretty darn impressive then to basically say, hey, the star seen here in the Matthew story is trying to emulate and usurp the story about the very founding of Rome and the Roman dynasty of Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus. If I was going to try to one-up, I would want to one-up Julius Caesar before Nero.
Yeah,
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Carry on talking about that. Give me a second.
All right. Manuel Murillo says, do you think it's, and thank you for the super chat, do you think it's possible some of the nativity story came from King Herod's wife, Miriam, messing around with Uncle Joseph while Herod was on trial?
That's, it's a little speculative, but well,
this is where that guy wrote that story. That's why he was saying that there's names that sound like they might.
Yeah. Well, of course, also remember there's one significant difference is that we see that, Miriam, she is alive, towards the end of Jesus's life. Allegedly, she's even showing up for the crucifixion and coming to the tomb. In the story with Miriam the First, she's killed by Herod because he's so suspicious. So that's a notable difference. So if we want to fit the puzzle pieces together, we're going to have to cut the puzzle pieces a bit, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's what happens all the time when people are doing
It's an interesting speculation because of the names involved, but it's also worth noting, I also have some doubts that Jesus' father was called Joseph for a couple of reasons. First off, what is he doing in the story? He's interpreting dreams. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, this is a good point. Yeah, Joseph.
Yeah,
that's...
so there's that. And also there is a tradition that, we only see it attested later on, but a tradition in post temple destruction Jewish literature that there was a concept of two messiahs. There was, of course, the Messiah, son of David, but also the Messiah, son of Joseph, who was killed.
Mm-hmm. They're trying to make him both, it seems, in some way.
So that, screams out to me. It's like, it sure looks like people are trying to make, these sorts of connections. So yeah, I even have some doubts. I have even more doubts about who Jesus's daddy was.
Wow. Who's your daddy and what does he do? Jonathan, can we wrap this up in 20?
Yep. Because
Please.
I think, the next place to go is to talk about the census. And that's such a massive topic that requires, time spent on it separately. But I think let's go back to, we've got this idea that how can it be that Luke would not include any of this stuff that we've just been talking about? How can it be that Luke would have this narrative where they come down to Bethlehem from Nazareth, Jesus is born, and they literally, the language is they go straight back. It says after this happened, and after this happened, they went back. There's no gap there for a 2-year refugee crisis in Egypt, and that's a problem. But also you get this idea, and someone mentioned it in the comments earlier, which is why are the Magi never heard from again? So these guys that don't exist in Luke, but then Luke has instead, because he's got a different audience, and I say he's appealing to the sort of Gentiles, so therefore the bucolic shepherds, linking to David again, perhaps, but with the Greek-speaking world, shepherds are really a lot more important. The humble shepherd. He has the shepherds coming to give praise to Jesus. They're never heard from again. We've got a real problem that neither of these two have these worshippers. Like they only exist in separate gospels, and B, they are never heard from again. These should be perfect evangelists. They've seen an incredible thing. They've seen God being born as a human being, or the Messiah being born. Either way, they're never heard from again. This is a massive problem.
And worse than that, it's even worse than the silence, because again, with our friends, the Magi, they're supposed to go home and, allegedly tell the news and impress all their other members of the same religious caste that, they went and worshipped, the Jewish Messiah, which also is weird because the Zoroastrians also have their own concept of the Messiah, the Sasoyan, who is supposed to be born in the opposite direction. So that's already a problem. But here's the thing. We have records as well from later on where we see that the Magi are persecuting Christians, which is a weird thing if they're earlier on we're literally worshiping him as a baby.
Absolutely. And here's a quote from Luke 2:17 onwards. So Luke 2:17 onwards says, when they being the shepherds, when they had seen him, they made known the statements which had been told them about this child, i.e. the angels appearing to them and telling them. And all who heard it were amazed about the things which were told them by the shepherds. And then it says, but Mary treasured all these things, pondering them in her heart. And the shepherds went back, glorifying and praising God for all that they had heard and seen, just as had been told them. This is Luke claiming that they have told lots of people, and lots of people are amazed by what they told them about the glorifying, about all these wonderful things. And yet no one knows about Jesus for another 30 years. Something's going wrong here. And yet no one knows about, the Magi go back and apparently tell no one. Literally, they followed a star, had it got the king involved, been partly responsible for the murder of a bunch of children, seen God incarnated in human form, go back home, perfect evangelist for a new religion, and are promptly never heard from again. And that new religion is just snuffed out. And we know nothing about Jesus for another 30 years.
To put all of that into simple terms, what makes more sense? This really happened, or the author is doing something literary here? It's really simple. And the last thing I would ever have accepted was the latter. Now the last thing I would ever accept, unless God revealed it to me and showed me and did that would be the only way. I just my threshold of what would be required is much higher. If my wife walked in here and told me she's preggo and I've been gone for 3 years and she said it was like a miracle, the last thing I'm going to believe is what she just told me. I'm sorry. Don't care what, you don't trust your wife? You don't have faith in your wife? I know how the world works. And to assume the least improbable, I got to play this clip real quick. Just this one little clip for everybody to understand where I'm coming from, because I don't think you do.
You mean not good like 1 out of 100?
I'd say more like 1 out of 1 million.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
Brilliant.
Yeah,
always love that.
It's always my little clip I play whenever there's a chance. There's a chance.
It's so true. It's the possibiliter ergo probiter fallacy, which is if it's possible, therefore it's probable. You know, I can conceptually this is precisely what goes on with when we do end up talking about the census, which is how do I marry Quirinius and Herod? How do I get these two disparate dates and ideas together? Well, you conceive of something, you just make up something that is conceptually possible, like a Roman governor ruling twice. And then you say, well, I can conceive that, therefore that's what happened. You go, hang on, okay, I can conceive that happens, but I can conceive that unicorns exist. And I can conceive that you've been probed by an alien. But what's the evidence that this has happened, right? You can't just throw in a conception and say, there, I've answered you, job done, Christianity wins. It's that, no, okay, you have to present something that is more plausible historically than what I'm presenting. Because if you don't present something that's more plausible, you are irrational in believing the thing that is least plausible.
Oh, let's try this. Is it conceivable that Mary was virginally impregnated?
I mean, are you talking about unprobabilistic? Like is there a chance?
Mm-hmm.
On naturalism, no, not really.
I was going to say that if it's conceivable, then she conceived. That's as close as we're going to get for evidence. Unfortunately, puns.
Oh man, that's good. I like it. It's conceivable.
You mean terrible? You mean absolutely terrible?
Well done, Aaron. My respect.
I should let it be known that I used to teach physics at the college and high school level, and yes, all physics teachers have to have an entourage of terrible puns to present to their students.
Excellent.
Wow. So, all right, with 10 minutes left, can we miraculously cover this census? And I plug you guys on our way out when we're done.
We can give a taster.
Okay, tease us because we might have to do another episode.
So, yeah, well, I think the census really, really deserves a whole episode on its own. So this is what Luke 2 says. Now, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken of the inhabited earth. That's an interesting thing. So we got Caesar Augustus decreeing a census be taken of the inhabited earth. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. So that's interesting. So Quirinius was governor of Syria. And also the term the first census, or is this, what does that mean? The first census, the first that Quirinius has done, or the first one that's ever done in Syria? Okay, interesting stuff going on there. And all the people were on their way to register for the census, each to his own city. Wow, that's interesting. So everyone had to go to their own city. Now Joseph went up from Galilee, it's actually down, but that's a turn of phrase, from the city of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. And this is the key. Because he was of the house and family of David, in order to register along with Mary, who was betrothed to him and was pregnant. So Mary goes as well. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. So on and so forth. So what we have there is a very clear description of a census for which we have absolutely no historical rationale for believing in. So we know a census took place in CE under Quirinius. Okay, I accept that. But everyone had to return to their ancestral homes to be registered is utterly preposterous as an idea, because these are Romans doing it for tax reason. What you would do is everyone would go, a censor would go to a municipal town, and then people in that local little area would go to the municipal town to register their property and how much money they had, and then would go back home, like little, or it would be literally be in their home, and that's how you do a census, and then you'd know how much this area was worth, so that you could tax it, however much you're going to tax it. What you don't have is the entire inhabited earth going back to their ancestral homes. And how is this the ancestral home for Joseph? Well, we've had a genealogy from Luke. It's 41 generations from Jesus back to, or Joseph back to David. So what Luke is implying here is that people had to return to their ancestral homes of 41 generations past. That's like 1,000 years or whatever. Like, who knows that? Why would you do that? Why would the Romans go, I know what's a good idea. Let's get everyone to just get up and move to wherever their ancestors were from 1,000 years before and do a census there. So the country stops for however long it takes for that to happen. No one's working on the fields. No one's working in the inns. No wonder there's no space left in the inns, since they're not working in them. Like, they're all like traveling around to go to their ancestral homes, and then they return home, and then they've got census records that mean nothing. It's meaningless records. It's like, oh, now I know that these people lived over there and those people lived over here, but what do I know about taxing this area? Nothing. This tells me nothing. It's ridiculous. And that's just a morsel of problems.
Yeah, I just actually ran the numbers. I was just thinking about this. If every descendant of David, or everyone who allegedly had a descendant or was a descendant of David, had to go back to Bethlehem, I just did a quick calculation for how many people that would be, and it's over 1 million.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's no room in the inn. There's no room in Israel for 1 million people at this time.
No, it's crazy. It's crazy. And so so what happens is Christians then go, oh no, we can't have this. So it has to mean certain things, or we have to look for precedent for an ancestral home census, and then use things like this Egyptian census, which is completely a false analogy. And then they do all this stuff, and it's utterly disingenuous, and it's hugely dishonest, and it's doing really bad history, and they just make, I think it's embarrassing the way they try and make these two, Herod and the Quirinius census, fit. And I think it's terrible.
You know, my interview with Dr. Steve Mason, he points out that Luke is using Josephus, and I think he really, he takes like 4 hours in an episode with me to methodologically show Luke is using Josephus, and I'm talking about Josephus's 93 AD publication. So there are clear. So when Christians are reading Luke and they find something that has a historical nugget, or there's a basis there where you'd go, that sounds like history. Like, that sounds like that's something that is historical, which is why they confuse him as a historian. You can almost bank on that coming from Luke's knowledge of Josephus. This is why it's like all you have to do is lift from an actual historian to say, oh, there's history, and add this into your text. The reason he did this in an episode, and I can't remember the exact details of where it was, but there's a certain place and a person mentioned, had nothing to do with the story, but you find it in Josephus, and it adds no value. It literally just becomes an interruption of like, why is that there? And he's like, this is why. If you look in Josephus, he mentions this in this location that has nothing to do with the story. But it's almost like here's my thumbprint showing you that I lifted this. So anything that sounds like it might be, historical, while mixing it into this theological narrative, that would be something he's saying is coming out of Josephus.
I mean, it's the whole census thing is just a complete joke. I mean, Quirinius was, this was in a different tax area. Galilee was not required to do the census anyway. You had no need for women to go to the census. So why would you take an 8-9 month pregnant betrothed woman on either? So here's great. I had a massive argument with someone who's been trolling my YouTube channel, a Christian. He's a reverend, and when I debated with Lydia McGrew back last year on Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio, he trolled me straight away after this. He trolled all the YouTube pages for Unbelievable, and he's a reverend, and he puts stuff on Twitter and then he deletes it because when he starts getting beaten in the debate, he deletes the evidence of it and then accuses you of deleting something. Anyway, whatever. But it's just like, this is a standard. So this guy says, okay, like, I can't accept that a 9-month pregnant woman's going to give birth. So she's 3 to 4 months pregnant. It's not a contradiction because she's 3 to 4 months pregnant. But hang on, Luke says they're going down for a register in a census. There's no room for them at the inn. So how can she then stay for 5 to 6 months to then give birth still in an inn? Right, for a census, like, so okay, your problem to get round. What my point of saying this is, to solve a problem, they create more problems. So to solve the problem of a 9-month woman, pregnant woman going 80 miles on donkey back, he says, A, Luke doesn't mention a donkey, and B, she's 3 to 4 months pregnant. So A, where's the evidence of the 3 to 4 months? There isn't any. You're making this up. She gives birth while she's down for registering, and they're still in an inn. So that doesn't make any sense of your timeline. And okay, I'll accept that she wasn't on donkey back because Luke doesn't mention donkey. But what's the alternative? She walks. So now you're saying she has to walk. Okay, she's not on a donkey. She's walked for 80 miles, 8 to 9 months pregnant, or 3 to 4 months pregnant, or she's on a cart on unmetalled roads bouncing around. That's even worse. So it's the idea that these Christians come up with these fudging the data and trying to come up with apologies for these problems, and they create more problems for themselves. And that's why I say it's embarrassing. Just admit it. Just admit these are problematic stories.
Yeah, I love how easy it is coming off our lips and how difficult it is to enter their ears. I can tell you that. It's not easy. And I know from experience. No way to get through. So, gentlemen,
you've got one super chat, I think.
I did want to mention. Yeah, I thanked Leah. I think I'm saying it. Lee. Merry fake Christmas or Fakemas, everyone. Thanks once again. Always enjoy. I appreciate your support. Thank you for the super chat. And any final words before I let you guys go? Because we have to do a whole show.
Yeah, so I think we should probably keep them hoping for more. So yeah, talking about my subject matter, it's got a lot of history and we can talk a lot of astronomy and things like that. By the way, since I mentioned astronomy, we have a Christmas gift, an astronomical Christmas gift that we've been waiting 25 years for. Christmas Day, we are launching the James Webb Space Telescope. And if this thing works, if everything goes well, we are going to be peering into the development of planets elsewhere in the galaxy. We might be looking at galaxies from basically as close to the birth of the universe as we can find them. And literally, the rocket goes off on Christmas Day right now. It's going to take 6 months to get to its destination and fold out. And my sphincters are going to be clenched the whole time, hoping for the best for this thing, because it's an expensive, amazing piece of technology where a lot could go wrong, $10 billion down the drain, or it could become the next best Hubble telescope. We're really hoping for that. So that's something we should all be looking forward to, because science is really the reason for the season. We will definitely want to talk more about my subject, and I'll probably also be spamming some of the other YouTube channels as well. I'm thinking I'm going to be bothering Neil at Gnostic Informant. We're going to talk about the astronomy and astrology of Zeitgeist and where that goes wrong.
That'll be fun.
There's a lot. I mean, the Star of Bethlehem, there's an awful lot of conversation to be had on what's happened over history as to how people have tried to explain the star. And Aaron just absolutely, I mean, it's such a good book that people think it's a real niche subject, but that is the go-to book on that niche subject. But it's also really interesting and has ramifications outside of just that tiny little area. Well worth it. Brilliant book.
I definitely want everybody to go check out his website, of course. That's down in the description, draaronadair.com. Be sure to go check it out. If you want to get deep or dive into some of this stuff, there's this guy named Jonathan MS Pearce as well. He has a blog, and just be following the links down in the description. You guys can follow them. Also, he has a YouTube channel. Go subscribe to the YouTube channel. Check out his content. You can get lost in all of the material. He's even interviewed me. If you really want to waste your time listening to me rant about my story, I definitely recommend you go check it out. He also has books, tons of books. You can go check out the books, have fun doing that. Lots of material. We're going through this. We're almost done with the resurrection, a critical examination. And right today is the first day we jumped into the Nativity. We're branching off into this book in particular. Also, Aaron's books on Amazon down in the description. Don't forget to also check us out here on the Patreon. Tons and tons of videos. I'm constantly working my butt off. I can't tell you, this is going to be a really good one. The Garden of Eden is actually a Babylonian thing. And that this is a scholar, Bruce Wells, who's going to tell you he thinks he's got the narrative figured out. He thinks he knows where and around the time in which the narrative of Genesis was actually written. Also, Joseph Smith, did he believe in his own crap? And yes, this guy does say he does, even though he did lie about many things. And the gentleman I interviewed on this, by the way, is a pastor of a Mormon church. So hear it from the horse's mouth, right? That's the way to go. Also, I just want to plug these things. This is a way I can keep doing what I'm doing here. Join the Patreon, tons and tons of videos. And I mean, literally hit load more and you'll go for days. I mean, you'll never cover all the content. Probably 400 or 500 videos that have never made it onto YouTube are on the Patreon. So you can go and check that out as well. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today, and it's almost Christmas time.
Can I just say, so the next episode will be largely obviously what Aaron said about if we're both back on together, that would be fantastic. I don't know if that's we're able to do that, Derek. But
if the stars line up,
there's a conjunction of 3 stars. This is that's such. I love it. But certainly a lot to say about the census and how ridiculous it is. But also the Christian apologetics that try to excuse the claims that are made. So, and about how they don't work. So it's not just about how it doesn't work first and foremost, but how the defenses also don't work. And I think Kip Davis was saying in the comments earlier, how do Christians try and move the dates of Herod or Quirinius around? And we can look at that a lot, which is what are their defenses for doing, or their strategies for doing that, and how they don't work.
Yeah,
but thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Aaron. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Adair. I really appreciate your wisdom and your thoughts, and just being a PhD and is a physicist.
That's at least one of my PhDs. Yes, though I did also get degrees in astronomy and mathematics because, again, I think I mentioned before, I cannot be killed. I have no life.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, and Alan Bird. Thank you for the final end of time, if you will, super chat here. Merry Xmas, Derek. Thanks for all the great content. Thank you, Alan. I appreciate you and all the support, everybody in the chat. It goes a long ways. And for those who tuned in and didn't get to see the intro, you get to see it because it's also going to be our outro. And I had a little fun with this one. So thank you all for everything. Don't forget to like the video, the 500 of you that are watching. And thank you for everybody who tuned in tonight. Never forget, we are MythVision.
MythVision.
Go and pray someone else's brat. Go on.
We were led by a star.
Fed by bottle more like. Go on out.
Well, we must see him. We have brought presents.
Out.
Gold, frankincense, myrrh.
Well, why didn't you say he's over there?
Dear tiny Jesus, your golden fleece diapers with your tiny little fat balled up fist
He
pawing
was a man. He had a beard.
Look, I like the baby version the best. Do you hear me?
Dear 8 pound, 6 ounce, newborn infant Jesus. Don't even know a word yet. Just little infant, so cuddly, but still omnipotent.
We just thank you for all the races I've won and